Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the fourth and final P20 Literacy Collaborative for the 2020-2021 project year. And I'm Dottie Erb. I'm a co-facilitator with Mary Murray of the P20 Literacy Collaborative. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome any new members and others who are with us for the first time. Welcome to the P20 Literacy Collaborative. If we were meeting in person, I would make you stand up, but I would like to just say welcome. And I would also like to ask everyone here to make sure that you put your name and affiliation in the chat along with your email address. We want to make sure that we have correct email addresses for everyone. We've got an exciting and full agenda today. Our meeting outcomes are here on the slide to learn about the importance of early identification of reading difficulties and how to address them, to learn about current research on the potential reading achievement of students, to learn about research-based components of effective instruction, to learn about an outcome-based model for integrating assessment data and instructional decisions, and of course, to learn more about the efforts that are underway at our Ohio IHEs to improve preparation and practice in literacy, aligned with the science of reading and Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. We have a very engaging list of people who are going to be speaking with us this morning, and I'm going to start out with asking Mary to introduce our first group of speakers.
Thank you, Dottie. It's my great pleasure to introduce the next team that will be talking about why dyslexia matters and the importance. First member of the team is Dr. David Broback, who is an associate professor, program director in graduate education in Walsh University. He also is the head mentor for letters training, which has been, for me, a transformational experience. So I thank him for all the questions that he's answered throughout the last year that we've been doing the letters training. Dr. Amy Murdoch, the reading science program director and associate professor at Mount St. Joseph University. Dr. Mary Heather Munger, assistant professor, University of Findlay. Dr. Rebecca Tolson, vice president of literacy initiatives at Niehaus Education Center. A wonderful team of experts. So without further ado, we will have an amazing presentation on Dyslexia Matters. So thank you.
So, Mary Heather, how are we going to share the screen?
Well, we'll need to make Rebecca a co-host, and it should be in your Google Doc, or I can.
I have it. I didn't know if we were just going to do one person or.
Yeah, well, if you can bring it up, that would be great.
All right, give me a second here.
Rebecca, can you hear everybody okay?
Yes, I can.
Y'all do have permission to screen share, so whoever needs to put it up can go ahead and do so.
Give me just a second. I got to find the thing. It's always harder than one would. There we
Looks
go.
like we got it up.
Okay, are you guys viewing the?
I saw it for a second.
That's what I thought, and then let me try it again. Only a second. Are you viewing it or no?
Yep.
What we see, yeah, is your slide deck. And
Okay, there we go.
go here, we got presentation. All right.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I'm Rebecca Tolson, and I'm looking forward to talking about dyslexia with you this morning. So we're going to start off, what is dyslexia? So 5 to 17% of the US population has dyslexia. This is from the Shaywitzes, published in 1998 from the Connecticut longitudinal study. And that is, dyslexia is a continuum. And that means that when overall in the population, from mild, moderate to severe, we see in the population that prevalence rate. So I want to talk for a few minutes where we get the term dyslexia. It's been controversial in the past. And, you know, we get dys, a root of that term, meaning difficulty, and lexia, meaning with words. So the term is Greek, dyslexia is difficulty with words. And what we're going to see in the definition, that is in the decoding piece of understanding language. So the definition of dyslexia I'd like to share with you today is from IDA, the International Dyslexia Association, adopted in 2002. And there's several different definitions out there of dyslexia, but we like to, I like to highlight the one from the International Dyslexia Association because it's the one that is universally used. And dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. And that means that it is the way that the brain is developed. And it's, I always tell my students, it's not a bad brain. It's just how your brain works. So we do see that through fMRIs. And we can see how that the typical brain processes language and reads. And then we can see how a student with dyslexia processes as they read. So that's something that came out in Dr. Shaywitz's book in 2003, which was Overcoming Dyslexia. And we saw those brain and the development of the brain and the neurological origin of that from the definition. So next, I'd like to highlight that it's characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and poor spelling and decoding skills. So when we look at the definition of dyslexia, we want to look at that student who is inaccurate and non-fluent. And the inaccuracies we see in errors when they read, such as substitutions, transpositions, omissions, insertions. So they're inaccurate, and we can track those errors. And we say, why are they making those errors? Why are they missing those sounds? So that's part of the definition of dyslexia. And it's one of the main components or symptoms that we're able to say, you know, this is a third grader who's not decoding on grade level. And we see those inaccuracies. We see that lack of fluency. This often, not always, but most of the time runs with a difficulty with spelling, because decoding and encoding are very similar processes. And so we see that weak spelling come out. I actually think it's easier to analyze a student's spelling to see what's going on with their language skills, because that's what they're understanding. A lot of times that's what they're hearing, understanding, or processing phonologically. So it impacts the decoding skills. Main way that we find them through assessment is how is their decoding related to their grade equivalencies or age. Difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. And I like to say that we say, why are those symptoms happening? And the main deficit is a phonological deficit, which means it's how they process the sound system of our language. So how do they, can they rhyme? Can they segment sounds? Can they blend sounds? Can they manipulate sounds, which is all important factors in learning to read. And additionally, the definition is difficulties. These difficulties are unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. And I like to say that it is not an intellectual disability. That's a different disability altogether. So this is a specific learning disability that is not related to their intelligence. And so we see, average to above average to even superior intelligence that struggle with dyslexia. So even though they're innovative and creative and good thinkers, the print is very hard. So this isn't a thinking disability. It is a learning disability that affects language. Now, the provision of effective classroom instruction, I always say we have good teachers with good programs. And the majority of kiddos are learning to read from those good teachers and those good programs. But a student with dyslexia, because it is neurobiological, is going to struggle learning to read regardless of those. And so that's why it's unexpected. So when we look at that issue or that concern, we see the secondary consequences, not the primary consequence. So the primary consequence is that they struggle with decoding. Because they struggle with decoding, the secondary consequence impedes vocabulary growth and comprehension. Because they read less and they're exposed to less text sequentially, grade after grade, year after year. So they're not lifting that print enough to keep up with their peers in those areas. So it's a secondary, not a primary consequence of dyslexia, is vocabulary and comprehension. So here's our primary characteristics of dyslexia. Difficulty reading words in isolation. So if they don't have context, it's specifically hard. Difficulty accurately decoding familiar words, unfamiliar words. So we say, how do we know? If we don't know that word, if that's not a word I've learned or been exposed to, I don't have a strategy to decode it. How do I read that word? So that's one of the main characteristics, is their inability to decode unfamiliar words. We know we can find that from pseudo word or word attack measures when we're doing assessments. So if they can't read, if they can read regular words, cat, sat, bat, rat, but we give them a nonsense word like Z-A-T, they might say zate, they might say zut. And we thought they understood the pattern, but really the unfamiliar word to them is they don't have a strategy to say what makes that A say ah or short. And those are the syllable patterns in our language. Now, difficulty with oral reading might be slow, laborious, and inaccurate. So we do see fluency impacted as a main characteristic. So that I love to say those, the 1 minute measures to say, it's a temperature check to say, is there a problem with their reading? And that doesn't tell me what the problem is and how to fix it, but it does tell me they're at risk of reading failure. And we can tell that by their rate and their prosody, because it will be not only laborious, but it'll be like monotone, and it won't have inflection and intonation because it's a struggle. And then lastly is difficult with spelling. Like I said, I can tell from their spelling what's going on with language. And that's why I like to see how they can spell, so I can see what's going on with their interpretation of language. So you will see that as a main characteristic. Now, the foundational deficits, just to kind of summarize, are at that phonological level, also specifically at the most advanced layer of phonological awareness, which is phonemic awareness, where we have to segment and blend. So, we say that's a main characteristic. By second grade, kiddos are doing that. Typical learners are doing that advanced phonological, consistently blending and manipulating sounds. And a student with dyslexia, it will persist as a deficit or a struggle. Learning the letter names and their associated sounds, sound symbol correspondence, can be very difficult for students with dyslexia. And also, so I always like to say, if by, I always second semester kindergarten, and they aren't naming those letters, just boom, I know that's an R, that's a B, that's a C. and I can't put the sound with that, I'm concerned. I'm concerned because typical readers can learn, typical kindergartners know that by second semester kindergarten for sure, especially if they've had pre-K. And then phonological memory. So when they're decoding and encoding and sounding words out, you have to hold those sounds in to sound out longer words, multisyllabic words, words with blends. And so a lot of times when we say and this is a myth, it is not about reversing letters at all. Very few students with dyslexia do have that, because most kiddos, when they're learning the print, do that typically. But in the mid-first and second grade, that goes away, which means those letters are stable, meaning that the shape, the sound, the feel, everything about that is stable, and they don't make those errors. But a child with dyslexia will persist into upper grades, still lacking stability with the sound symbol correspondence. So when they have to retrieve all those sounds in the right order. Sequence matters when we're decoding and encoding, which means it affects that ability to remember and retrieve in the memory systems. And then rapid recall. So rapid automatized naming, because in order to gain fluency, we have to be rapid with what we're doing when we're recalling. So it does have a deficit there as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mary Heather Munger. Mary Heather, would you like me to stop sharing and you can share your screen?
Actually, I was going to ask if you would mind being the slide advancer, just to keep things running smoothly and we wouldn't have to switch between speakers. Is that all right?
I'm fine with that. Thank you. I can do that.
Hi, everybody. Go ahead to the next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about why this should matter to you. So how are we doing? If it didn't need to matter to you, the situation would be that everybody was reading well, but how are we doing? Dyslexia is actually the most common cause of reading, writing, and spelling difficulties that we see. And as Dr. Tolson mentioned, it affects between 5 to 17% of our population, which is quite a few students. About 3.5% of American students, slightly more than 2 million students. 2 million students. And you'll have to pardon me because sometimes I can get a little bit revved up about this. That's a lot of students. Those make their way into special education for this. It becomes a very significant issue and impediment to their academic progress. Next. This is information from the PIAC. These are adult literacy measures. And they break it down into 6 categories. And in the United States, 52% of people who participated in this, so the number is probably even larger, were at a level 2 or below, which in their literacy skills, which means those are just really basic skills about reading a form and being able to fill it out. So less than half, 48%, were at levels 3 or above. So we have a literacy problem in this country, and a large percentage of those students have dyslexia. Next. And they grow up to be adults, obviously. Here's the latest NAEP data. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. We have Ohio outlined against the national averages and the years on the x-axis. And as you can see, we don't even hit the proficient mark, which is not even a high bar. So obviously we have a problem on our hands. This is the why of why we need to be addressing this. Next. So if this large segment of our population doesn't have access to solid reading skills, what does that mean for our economy, our society, and our future? Next. If you have been to the Ohio Literacy Academy or you were a part of Readapalooza, you may be familiar with me and my story with my son. We've also spoken at IDA presentations together. And this is a very personal thing to me. So my oldest child has dyslexia. And so those of you who haven't heard our talk, the basic gist is I've been in each position as a parent of a student with dyslexia and as a teacher an intervention specialist. I was the teacher that people would send students to. And then I have my firstborn child having these difficulties. And it was really a struggle and difficult as a professional to grapple with me being the one responsible for helping these students. And many of my students were making progress, but not all of them. And then my own child, I was having difficulty helping. And that was just a terrible situation. It's difficult to admit that I want to share my story because I know I'm not alone. And I know there are others out there who are struggling with these same things. And it really wasn't until I got connected with the International Dyslexia Association and all of the training that's been going on that I became more confident in my abilities to teach reading. And again, I'm not alone. So it's important for us to get the word out there. I have a personal connection to this issue. Do you mind hitting the space bar, Rebecca? But what if you didn't? What if it wasn't personal to you and you couldn't emphasize, there should be an animation, but if there isn't, it's okay. Yeah, what if it isn't personal? Well, it's your professional responsibility to help these students. So on the next slide, I have a ray of hope. It doesn't need to be this way. So if we can make sure that structured literacy practices are happening in tier 1 instruction, we can really get those numbers down. We know that reading failure can be prevented. Really only a small percentage of students with serious learning disorders will have difficulty learning to read. We have a significant body of research that shows us that most of these gaps can be eliminated or closed significantly. This doesn't need to be the case if we can make sure that teachers are prepared appropriately to help these students. On the next slide, I have something a little bit crazy. We're going to watch a little video, and I'm going to give you, go ahead and hit the space bar. There we go. The link is embedded there. I'm going to give you a purpose for watching before we start. I want you to tell me what parallels you see between this that has nothing to do with reading and where we are presently. So be thinking about that as you watch this. It's just a few minutes. Go ahead and click on that. It should play. We'll have to go back. What? If you click on the text, Rebecca, the link should be there. All right. Thank you. We'll switch it to full screen. We get to watch an ad. How about sound, Stanley?
If that sound isn't coming through, you may have to reshare the screen and make sure that we have the share of the sound selected.
Rebecca, can you stop the video?
Yeah.
For?
Yeah.
All right, walk
Okay.
me through that, Stanley.
Okay, when you hit the share button and it brings up your options, there's a couple check boxes in that pop up. One will say optimize for sharing video and the other says share sound. And if you have those checked when you share your screen, it will allow the sound to come through on a video.
Got it.
Okay, you may have to rewind just a sec.
Okay, let me see if I can go back.
Came to the startling discovery that doctors could save the lives of patients simply by washing their hands. Although he couldn't explain why hand disinfection was so
Do you mind
effective,
going to the beginning of that?
in 1840.
Sorry,
It's okay.
we'll just miss. I don't want to begin. There we go. Thank you.
Years before the germ theory of disease was developed, the Viennese physician Ignaz Semmelweis came to the startling discovery that doctors could save the lives of patients simply by washing their hands. Although he couldn't explain why hand disinfection was so effective, his research in 1847 would go on to transform the way surgery is carried out and infectious diseases are controlled today. Known locally as the savior of women, Semmelweis initiated hand-washing policies which helped drastically reduce the mortality rate from childbed fever in the Viennese obstetrics clinics where he worked. Childbed fever, or puerperal fever, is the infection of the female reproductive organs following childbirth and was a common cause of death at the time. Semmelweis's attention was first drawn to the mortality rate of the clinics he worked at, because women would beg to be admitted to the clinics run by midwives rather than those staffed by students. The women were so desperate to avoid the student clinics that they would rather give birth in the street. After looking into the mortality rate of the two clinics, he found that the student-run clinic did indeed have a much higher mortality rate from puerperal fever, sometimes 3 times higher. After eliminating various factors, Semmelweis came to the conclusion that the students carried something from the dissection rooms where they performed autopsies to the patients they examined during labor. He ordered the students to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime before each examination. The mortality rate fell from 18% to 1%. Despite the success of his policy, Semmelweis faced the wrath of the medical community. He could offer no acceptable explanation for his findings, as the notion that there were germs causing disease was unaccepted, and various doctors were offended by the insinuation that their hands were dirty. He was ostracized and ridiculed by the leading medical figures of his time and eventually driven out of Vienna. After struggling for years to promote his hand disinfection policies, Semmelweis was admitted to an insane asylum at the age of 47. He died 14 days later.
Okay, thank you.
Brush your teeth
Becca.
in less.
We'll go back to the slideshow. So think for a moment, that story actually gets better. I mean, not better, but there's more to that story in
Than
that
10
Dr.
seconds.
Semmelweis, after he was admitted to the asylum, he was kind of he was a difficult person to deal with. And the story goes that he was in a fight and sustained an open wound during that altercation with one of the guards. He developed sepsis and begged to have the wound cleaned, and they refused, and he died of sepsis. We do know that. The story about the guard is up for debate. He died of sepsis 14 days after being admitted to this asylum. So he died of the very thing he was trying to prevent, which is maybe he died of irony. But I'm wondering if you guys can share with me some parallels you see between what was happening there and what's happening in the field of reading. If you could just unmute. Are they able to do that, Stanley, or should we do it in the chat box?
Yes, they can.
Okay. Who can see a parallel? Just offer it up. Is there a solution to the problem at hand? No pun intended on that.
Well, my first thought, Mary Heather, is that the so-called reading wars, people hang on to what they've always done. I think one of the questions we've asked over, if it works so well, why aren't kids reading better?
Right, exactly. And he was ostracized and given a hard time about this. And there was a certain element of the doctors being offended that you're insinuating that we're not clean, that we don't have good hygiene habits. And there's some of that in higher ed. You're insinuating that I don't already know all about this. And so there's some pushback. So I want you to remember, Dr. Semmelweis, a couple of people are putting some comments in the chat. A lag in research to practice. Yep, we're trying to fix literacy with the science of reading, but can't explain it. We're working on that. There may be preventative measures that folks disregard because of best practice. Great. So thank you for your input. And remember this story the next time you're thinking about the science of reading. One of the drawbacks in this parallel is that teaching reading is not as simple as washing your hands. It's a much more complicated process, a much more complicated answer, but we can do it. It is possible. We have a wealth of understanding and knowledge under our belts, and we can do this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brubeck.
Thank you, Mary Heather. And Rebecca, if you could please continue, it would be greatly appreciated. So the question that I was asked is dyslexia in the law? Just for those of you who don't know me, my background is my 12th year at Walsh, but prior to that, I was a public school superintendent in Ohio in 2 different districts. I taught reading at the middle school level for 17 years, and then I was a middle school principal for 8 prior to the superintendency. But one of the things that brought this to mind too recently, I served on jury duty, and when the defense attorney and the prosecutor interviewed me, they went into great detail of what do you teach when you teach school law and ethics. And I talked about the Higher Revised Code and policy and following the law, which is why I was really excited when they passed House Bill 436, and we know that we're going to get some help here. So next slide, please. So our story started in 2018. This is my grandson, Leo. This is the summer before he went to kindergarten. So I'm going to try to explain the law through story and help you understand that that much like what you heard Rebecca say in explanation and what Mary Heather was saying in the example of germs, I think Leo's story, it does a good job of illustrating this. So my grandson, prior to the summer before kindergarten, he was in the Child Development Center in the town they live in, and they said, your son, to my daughter, can only identify 5 letters of the alphabet. 3 of them are L, E, and O, which spell his name. So next slide, please. So we came up with a plan. My daughter, my son-in-law is a physician. My daughter has a master's degree in music. And so my wife is a former kindergarten teacher, was dyslexia in play. So here are the early indicators we noticed. Leo didn't speak to start with. He had a speech delay. He called his sister Scarlett Anna, and we thought it was because of the movie Frozen, the cartoon. And when we finally said, why do you call her Anna? He said, well, I can't remember her name. And he would meet kids and he'd say, meet my new friends, this, and this. And he called them guys. And one little boy in North Carolina said, my name's not Guy, it's Homer. But Leo couldn't remember names. He lacked handedness. Today, he prefers writing with his left hand until he gets tired, then he'll switch to his right. He throws things with his right hand. He's trying to learn to play tennis. I noticed that sometimes he'll just switch. Instead of hitting a right-handed backhand, he'll try to switch to play a left-handed forehand. And he had the inability to remember letter names. So in my experience, and my wife's experience, we said there's a problem here. So what are we going to do? And I think this ties in directly to what Rebecca was telling you about some of the foundational pieces of dyslexia. Next slide, please. So as a family, we made requests. Again, I know at least enough as a former superintendent. We asked for a complete assessment. We asked that they develop, I should say, an IEP, and I'm sorry about that. I thought I fixed it, and we asked them to provide a summer support program. The answers to those questions were yes, no, and no. So they said they'd do the assessment, but they said, no, we don't think he'll need an IEP, and no, we're not going to do a summer program. So the next. And yes, I did misspell on this slide. I actually corrected these things last night. My apologies to Carrie Egan. It's Carrie, Kerry. But I set up a meeting with Carrie Egan's. My knowledge of Carrie at the time was I sat opposite the table from her when I was a superintendent and worked out agreements for students we didn't serve appropriately in a district I was superintendent. So we met with her for an hour. She walked us through what to expect because she had 5 cases with this same district. They had done 5 previous non-disclosure agreements so that people would not know what was going on. That was part of understanding the district history. She advised my daughter and son-in-law to meet with this decision makers and to state their specific expectations. So that was done very clearly. So if you go to the next slide, I try to capture the conversation a little bit. The district said, let's wait and see. He should be fine by the end of 2nd grade. He'll catch up then. Answer, we want an IEP now, and we're represented by Carrie Egan's. Response, we can work on the IEP and he'll have it at the start of kindergarten. It didn't quite go that fast, but it's really pretty much the way the story went. This is not the primary pathway for most children until now, until House Bill 436. Frank, I mean, it's clear Leo benefited from the fact that he had highly knowledgeable parents with the means. We could afford to pay Carrie Egan's for an hour of her time and to do this. But I want to move to the next phase of the story. If we go to the next slide, please. What happens is I used to go to superintendent meetings, and they would think spending money on special needs, whatever it is, that somehow that was not saving money. That if you waited until third grade and you waited till the kid got behind, that somehow that would solve the problem, would save money. Some people actually believe kids do catch up. Those of us with an expertise in reading, or those of us studied it, know that is not true. It was my belief that failure to recognize problems actually costs money, because it costs more to rehabilitate something than it does to do it right in the first time. I also think there's a lack of reading and literacy expertise from many school leaders. I didn't meet many male superintendents who were reading teachers. Female superintendents, a little bit different. And if you're wondering, my role model for the superintendency was Donna Lytle, who was the 4th female superintendent in the state of Ohio, because she was a reading teacher, and a lot of the stuff we were trying to do, it made sense. So if you understand their stories, and it goes back to, why did doctors believe that I'm clean, I don't have germs, because they couldn't see them. So I think that's part of it. So the next slide, please. So this is Leo today. He is just finished 2nd grade. He finished the year. He's been on an IEP. He will say to me, I'm dyslexic, right, Papa? And I said, yes. He says, yeah, I think I'm always going to be dyslexic. I said, well, that's true too. And he to me is an example of what can happen for any child, because if you go to the next slide, he was named the outstanding reader in a 2nd grade class this last year. And there are a couple things at play. One, my daughter was the reading coach. She left her job at the university to specifically support her kids because of COVID. But the reading specialist called at one point in time, and she said, I want you to work on decoding with Leo, because he simply memorizes the word the first time he sees it. And we know that he'll bypass it. He's fairly bright, yada yada. So Melissa would have to actually take him to and make him break the words down to show that he's still understanding decoding. And he said, well, it's, I already know that word. Well, let's decode it anyhow to make sure you know why the word sounds that way. So the next slide. It's one of my quotes that I remember seeing way back in my master's degree program. And I did my master's degree between 75 and 78, for those of you not born yet. But I like this particularly because I think it speaks to today. And it's still timely, that we have to fight for all kids. I don't want, just because my grandson Leo has grandparents and parents that are educated and can afford it, to be able to read at the end of 3rd grade. House Bill 436, and we're lucky today because both Rebecca and Amy are on the committee that's going to help define some of the things that we're going to do with this, that there's no reason why we can't reach every kid. We had an interview yesterday with a candidate for a position. She teaches at a very, very poor school district. She's looking to, as her doctorate, move into higher ed. But the challenge she talked about, that the high percentage of homes in their rural Appalachian community that didn't have internet. So kids were home, but they had no access to what the school was trying to do. There was no public library, no hotspots for them to go to. And their parents would leave for work today and take the smartphone with them, which was the one thing they had that could get them an internet. So, I appreciate everything we have with people here so we can fight this fight. And I know we'll have a little bit of time when we get done for Q&A, but I want for all kids what Leo has. So, Amy, you're up.
Thanks, David. And thanks, Rebecca, for advancing the slides. You could go to the next one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening in Ohio that are really exciting. And the kind of my 3 topics, I want to talk about the OSEP grant that we have in Ohio. I know it's been mentioned this meetings, but I want to give a little bit more information about that. The Ohio Dyslexia Committee that David mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then the last piece is just more of a invitation FYI to this group around a national alliance that is forming around the science of reading in higher education. So next slide, please. So I want to start with just talking a little bit about the Office of Special Education Program grant. In August of 2019, 3 model demonstration projects for early identification of students with dyslexia in elementary school were awarded. Next slide, please. And this is a really exciting opportunity for us, our little group in Ohio, because we get to connect with some real leaders in the area of dyslexia. So the 3 projects, the first one is at UCLA, led by Dr. Marianne Wolf. The second project is at the University of Houston, with a research group that Dr. Jack Fletcher leads. And then the third project is here in Ohio. Next slide, please. And our Ohio project is unique in that these other 2 projects are university-based. They're, great researchers, great leaders in the area of dyslexia. Our project is a collaboration with our fabulous Department of Education and Literacy. And Dr. Melissa Weber-Mayer, who's on this call, is our principal investigator. Carolyn Turner is another core member of our team. Lots of other great people with ODE are connected. So it's a collaboration with ODE Literacy and then Mount St. Joseph University, our reading science program. So myself and my colleague, Dr. Wendy Strickler, and then the University of Cincinnati's school psychology program, Dr. Julie Morrison. Next slide, please. So it's unique in that what we really want to do with this project is bring together all the fabulous work that has been done in Ohio around science of reading, and now really think about how do we also weave in the crucial population of children with dyslexia or those at risk with dyslexia. The other unique thing about our project that I'm really proud of is that our group really wanted to focus on those children who are underserved and have opportunity gaps. So our project has a criteria that we looked at schools that serve children living in poverty. I was really struck by Dr. Julie Washington's talk with us last time around, when everybody has a reading problem, you can't understand dyslexia, right? And so that's really what our project is trying to understand. How do we take care of everyone so then we can understand who truly has a reading problem and dyslexia? So our project is set up around science of reading and multi-tiered systems of support. So how do we make sure everyone has the access to that, great teacher, great program that Rebecca talked about, and then we can really understand dyslexia. Next slide, please. So some key components, focus on prevention and early intervention. Our project actually starts in preschool. So it's preschool through grade 1, because we know lots of children, it's not that they have dyslexia, they just haven't had the opportunities to gain those early language and literacy skills to set them on track. Louisa Moats talks about dystechia. I had a professor in grad school who used to say, we need another label, ABT, ain't been taught. We got to take care of that and make sure it's not about access, it's not about opportunity, it's truly about a way that your brain works differently. And so that's a big focus for us. So that's why we wanted to start in preschool and think about multi-tiered systems of support in preschool, kindergarten, and first grade. As part of our project, we're creating tools that help schools analyze their multi-tiered systems of support and how they're taking care of all children, and then how they use that to problem solve and create strong systems of support all the way through the eligibility and IEP process. So it doesn't end once they get an IEP, right? We want to make sure those IEPs are strong instructional supports that are going to help that child succeed with the right level of support. Next slide, please. Another key piece of our grant is also, what we're all about in this group, teacher knowledge. And so the teachers in this grant have gone through Science of Reading professional development. And at each school we're working with, 2 of them are also going through Mount St. Joseph University's dyslexia certificate program. So we're really trying to build the capacity of a school to have those knowledge and skills to take care of all children. Next slide, please. So we're working with 3 schools and we are currently at the end of year 2. And so we started with 1 school, and we have 2 urban schools and 1 rural school. One of our schools has a large number of children who are English language learners. So again, we're really trying to figure out things in populations that need us the most. Next slide, please. So that's kind of a brief overview of our OSEP model demonstration grant around dyslexia. And we're hoping to have lots of tools and also professional development that we can share with the wider Ohio group. We're also really excited timing wise because House Bill 436 came along just as we were finishing our first year of the model demonstration pilot project. And we thought, gosh, what a great way to connect the things that we're working on with this wonderful new law that's been put into place. So if you're not familiar with House Bill 436, it was passed April 12th, 2021, so recently. And part of the law outlines that, I encourage everybody to read the whole law, but I'm going to kind of give you some highlights, and my team members can definitely add things if they want to highlight something I didn't. But the law outlines requirements for dyslexia screening, teacher professional development in dyslexia, and the creation of this dyslexia committee. And I should say dyslexia screening and interventions, because that's super important. So here's a link to the Department of Education's site that talks about the law if you're interested. Next slide, please. So the committee, which as David said, Rebecca and I are fortunate enough to be appointed to, has 11 people. And it's a really wonderful committee. We had our first meeting. We meet for one full day each month. And then we've also been, we got to choose kind of a subcommittee that the subcommittees I'm guessing will probably meet more frequently to kind of push that work forward. So I know I'm on the subcommittee for assessment and intervention. And Rebecca, I believe, are you professional development? Was that the subcommittee you jumped onto?
Yeah, either that or certification are two options. Yeah.
Great. So nice diverse group in terms of background and role that really are charged with kind of moving this work forward. Next slide, please. So the big work of the committee is to create a guidebook, and we have a kind of tight timeline, December 31st, 2021. In this guideline, this is a quote from the legislation. This guideline is to outline the best practices and methods for universal screening, intervention, remediation for children with dyslexia or children displaying dyslexia characteristics and tendencies using a multisensory structured literacy program. So this guidebook is really the big work that the committee is undertaking. Additional pieces to the committee's work are to outline professional development for teachers and evidence-based dyslexia screening and intervention practices. Not that the committee's creating the professional development, but outlining what that should involve and look like is my understanding. And then also there's some charge for the committee to look at kindergarten academic standards in reading and writing connected to a multisensory structured literacy approach. Next slide, please. So super exciting work, just got started. We had our first meeting at the end of May. And I was excited after the first meeting. I felt like it was a good group of people. We actually started by looking at this issue through an equity lens, which I really appreciated. And yeah, I'm excited to see what happens. And as David said, this is, great in our world, and science of reading is all over, what we're talking about as we talk about dyslexia. It has to be. So the last thing I just wanted to say to this group, if you don't know already, and I know many people in this group are aware of this, but there's a movement kind of across the country to try to push higher education towards a science of reading. And some of us got together and said, you know what, we really want it to come from professors. We don't want outside people always saying, higher education, you're doing this, and this wrong, right? We really want there to be a body that we can support each other as we're moving towards the science of reading in our institutions, but also that we can help other entities like state departments or other people who are trying to do this in their state and think about the real work that is involved in higher education and the uniqueness of higher education, right? And so if you're not already part of, we have a Facebook group called Training Reading Rocket Scientists, which is a nod to Louisa Motz's work. It's a great group. This is really led by Dr. Stephanie Staller, my colleague, and she's had a couple meetings and people have shared syllabi and shared ideas and shared resources. Stephanie and I recently did a presentation with Louisa Moats and a couple other universities, Gordon College in Massachusetts and a University of Central Arkansas, who are also doing a lot of work at the state level and in their institution level to advance the science of reading. And in this presentation, we talked about kind of this alliance and then also what we want to do now. We've gotten some momentum and we want to formalize it into kind of a nonprofit organization. If you're interested in that, there's a link you can sign up and Dr. Staller will connect to you. We want to have this core group to kind of define what we wanted to do and move it forward. So just wanted to give that shout out if anybody in this group is interested in joining us. Thank you. I think I'm done. Thanks, Rebecca. Is it now question and answer time?
That would be great. I have one additional plug or question for the group, if they wouldn't mind. I'm working on a project to pull together districts that have been implementing these policies and are seeing good results. I'm not sure how many of you have tried to find that data, but it's not easily accessible in one place. So I'd like to work on that. If in the chat box, you could list a district that you're aware of and maybe a contact person I could reach out to start to collect this data, I would be most appreciative. And if you don't know a contact person, but you know that X district has been seeing some good results, I would appreciate I'll keep an eye on the chat box and just stick them in there and I'll collect the list. I'd appreciate that greatly. If anybody has any questions, let's move to the Q&A.
Maybe if we close this slideshow, people can see each other and they'll be willing to add some questions or give some input, feedback, expertise.
Well, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to thank you for all of the information today. I just found this so incredibly informative, and I just feel sort of excited about my job. I just am excited about the work that's happening and integrating more of a focus on dyslexia into my classes.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Mary Heather, this is Barb Cockcroft. I'm in Stark County, Ohio, former colleague of Dr. Brobeck here, having taught at Walsh University as a director of professional development in my past. But I'm working with Fairless Local School District, which is located in Navarre, Ohio, and we are on our 3rd year of letters training. We are using Alicia and Richard Sparks as our letters facilitators out of Cincinnati. And we are seeing really great strides with pretty much the middle school population is where my expertise is. I've been hired in addition to my responsibilities on SST9. I also have been hired for 55 other days to coach the teachers in grades 6 through 12, since my own personal background is adolescent literacy. And we are seeing very great strides. And Dave, I have to just share this with you. They hired a new teacher who is a graduate of Walsh, and she knew all about letters. And that was why they selected her, because everything they're looking at is through this equity lens and through the lens of, do these teachers know about the science of reading? And the fact that Walsh has been preeminent in doing this and teaching our pre-service teachers, a lot of people are looking in this area to hire graduates of Walsh. So I just was really, really proud of that. Had to share that with you. But
you.
I put in the chat Mike Hearn, who is the curriculum director of Fearless Local, and he would be a really great contact for anyone to reach out to, sharing the Fearless story and how it has really helped these children in this very, very rural community. So I hope that helps folks.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Now, for those of you that, if somebody asks you about the science of reading, one of the questions we asked the candidate yesterday who fully trained in letters, has a reading endorsement, teaches third grade. And what my question was, we know we're on the right track, but what are you seeing as a practitioner? And the discussion they had in their school was that they now were able to go back and work with the students who were not able to decode as they came into third grade. And suddenly, the school said, well, let's just divide and we'll have first K through 2 together and 3 through 5 together. And they had to work through that because students weren't prepared for third grade because they didn't have the decoding skills. And that was the gap that the science of reading has filled in for that district, even with limitations of the internet. And once they had the kids back in school, the teachers then had strategies and knew exactly how to get back in and involved with this work. And I know that the whole strategy thing is something, you see Jennifer Otley's on here today, that that her group is working on and trying to give teachers access to better strategies more at their fingertips. So I just saw that as so hopeful. We are doing what we need to do, and every little bit is going to make a difference.
And Dave, if I could piggyback on that comment, I was invited to speak to all of the intervention specialists in January of 2020 before the whole COVID thing began in March, or I should say February. But I just shared with them, don't say on an IEP that a child has a reading comprehension problem. I shared with them, Scarborough's rope, and I shared with them the science of reading, and I shared with them how you need to drill down into the specifics of what has gone amiss. And the fact that I personally have been interested in, the brain research for over 25 years, to the fact that my own colleagues said that I was doing my whatever down in my classroom, but my students were showing great growth for all those years. The intervention specialist said to me after the meeting, they said this was so insightful. And so now they know at least a look for. They may not have been trained yet in the science of reading, but they're very hopeful as to what exactly is the difficulty, like just kind of peeling that onion and figuring out which layer it is. That is it decoding, is it language comprehension, all these different strands. And so I just feel if we can just get this message out to our intervention specialists, because as you guys stated in your slide, so many of these children who are dyslexics are in a special ed setting. And is that really appropriate for those children? So.
Dottie, Mary, I put in the chat the coming soon postcard for the third round of Improving Literacy Partnership Grants. So look for that RFA to come out on Monday, actually. And Jennifer, do you want to mention maybe just a couple things about that?
Sure, thanks, Deb. We're again focused on working collaboratively with institutions of higher ed to restructure and revise their core literacy courses so that they include approaches to teaching reading that are structured and aligned with the science of reading throughout their 4 core reading courses for the first priority, and then the second priority focuses on embedding the same content within TESOL programs. In addition to that, realignment and re-strengthening of programs for both of the priorities, we're really focused on partnerships with districts and working collaboratively to improve programs and the work the work that's being happening in partnership together, including clinical experiences and opportunities to apply in the field what candidates are actually learning within their coursework. There's a very intentional aspect of the work that focuses also on building the capacity of faculty members. So what professional learning are faculty members at the institution being involved in to develop their own knowledge? The partnership and participation in the community of practice, like all of us are on here, is another aspect of that work. And so this is one opportunity to develop some professional learning, but then how are you going to extend what you learn here to further develop those skills together? So we're really excited. We anticipate right now funding 4 projects, and we'll see how many proposals we get. In the 28th, it's a Monday, will be the bidders conference for that process that's coming forward. And we're looking forward to working with our new round of grantees.
Okay, well, thank you to Dave and your team. That was so informative. We are going to take about a 10-minute break. We will come back and join our speaker, Jan Hasbrook, at approximately 10:30. So if everybody just wants to take a quick coffee, restroom break, we'll be back. Welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Jan Hasbrook. Jan is a researcher, educational consultant, and author. She served as executive consultant to the Washington State Reading Initiative and as an advisor to the Texas Reading Initiative. Dr. Hasbrook was a reading specialist and literacy coach for 15 years before teaching at the University of Oregon and later becoming a professor at Texas A&M University. Dr. Hasbrook has provided educational consulting to individual schools across the United States, as well as in Mexico, Peru, Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, and Germany, helping teachers, specialists, and administrators design and implement effective assessment and instructional programs targeted to help low-performing readers. Dr. Hasbrook earned her BA and MA from the University of Oregon and completed her PhD at Texas A&M. Her research in areas of reading fluency, reading assessment, coaching, and English learners has been published in numerous professional books and journals. She is the author and co-author of several books, including Conquering Dyslexia, Reading Fluency, Student-Focused Coaching, and Educators as Physicians, along with several assessment tools. Dr. Hasbrook works with the McGraw-Hill publishers as an author of their Wonders and Wonder Works reading and intervention programs. In 2019, she helped found Read Washington, a nonprofit organization with the mission to provide professional development opportunities based on the science of reading so that every student becomes a skilled and confident reader. And probably most importantly, she enjoys volunteering at her grandson's K-8 school in Seattle. So Jan, welcome to the Ohio P20 Literacy Collaborative. We're excited to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. I do quite a bit of these kinds of presentations, and this one I'm genuinely excited about because of who you all are. It is an honor and a privilege that I really hold dear to talk to people doing the work that you're doing. which I have done for a very long time, not anymore in a formal, regular way, training our future teachers, training our future professors and teacher trainers. All of that work is just so vitally important and challenging. I want to talk about all of those things today. I sent you a bunch of handouts, and Stanley has put them into the chat. There is one that's a PDF of my slides, so if you like to use that for note-taking or just for following along, that's available. An article, some PDF versions of some of the charts I'm going to share with you today. So bunch of stuff, and you can access that when you're ready to do that. So I'm going to get my slides ready here, and always cross my fingers a bit that actually works. So you should be seeing a slide that says launching all students successfully.
And we do.
Oh, excellent. That's wonderful. So I wanted to start, we had in the background preparing for this, I was truly honored and excited to be invited, and really humbled when I went back and looked at some of the other presenters that you've had. So I know those of you who have attended all of the sessions have had a whole lot of superb information from a variety of folks. So we discussed different things that I could perhaps be helpful with, and landed on this idea because my career has really been devoted to working with the children who find learning to read, write, and spell difficult, including students with disabilities, students with dyslexia, and just those other children who struggle for varieties of reasons. So we talked about that being the focus. And I also wanted to spend a moment just talking about why I'm using the term vulnerable readers. For a long time, I used the term struggling readers, and in those wonderful collaborative conversations that we have with our peer colleagues that shift our thinking a little bit, I now prefer to use the term vulnerable readers for this reason. There are a lot of children who need more help than is expected, more help than most children do. And when they receive that help in a timely, effective manner, sometimes they don't look like they're struggling. They may look like they're on level and they're hanging in there, but they remain vulnerable for a lot of reasons. And I think I really think it's valuable for us to think that way and help our future teachers think that way, that just because a student is performing adequately, it may be the result of your hard, extraordinary work and tons of scaffolding support. But so many of these students do remain vulnerable. So that's why I'm using that term. I think it's very important. Just last week, I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues, and she talked about, she has a child with severe dyslexia, and she was talking about that he's doing fine. He's about to graduate from high school and he's going to go on to college, and he needs tons of supports. It's like she was saying, it felt to her like her son had finally received a wheelchair that helped him with his literacy, and that he needs that wheelchair forever. He is a vulnerable reader, even though right now he looks like he's doing well. Food for thought, and we can talk about that later. And then I thought we should probably start off talking about why I think you should be thinking about vulnerable readers. I think that in the past, one of the things that universities have been, in my mind, justifiably criticized about is preparing our future teachers in silos. So we have our special ed teachers in one silo and our general education teachers in another silo, and too often very little interaction between the two. Even though, of course, in this general education classroom that we're now often using the term tier 1 for, that all of our teachers are responsible for all of the students, including those with disabilities, including those that have challenges, including dyslexia, including those students who are vulnerable and may remain vulnerable throughout their learning career. So all of our teachers need to be prepared to be thinking about the full spectrum of our children, knowing that in the absolute best situation, those teachers are going to get support to provide those scaffolds and interventions and that our students will need. So that's why I'm thinking it's an important conversation for those of us and you who prepare future reading teachers. And the other thing I thought as a frame for our discussion today is just an acknowledgement of the fact that the expectations on the work that you are doing is higher than ever. There's a big spotlight right now on how teachers are being prepared to go out to the world, especially in the area of reading. And you are probably all very well aware of a lot of that activity going on social media, Twitter and Facebook. There's a Facebook group called The Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College. And it grows rapidly. Last time I looked, it had 92,000 members of that Facebook group. And I think it was on that group that I saw this quote while I was preparing this session for you and thought it was relevant. There are people out there who feel very angry, bitter, a lot of other emotions about the level of preparation that they received in their university. So this was somebody writing about a teacher member of an interview committee and talking to future colleagues who had been prepped at a nearby university. We don't know what university or in what state, but this is the kind of typical thing I'm seeing, and I know that you're seeing. She wrote that when the candidate was asked, what would you do if you had a second grade student who's reading well below grade level, their responses included things like reading buddies and practicing sight words. Struggling readers deserve teachers who are ready to identify where a student is struggling and prepared to address weaknesses with evidence-based instructional practices, exclamation, you can just hear the passion there. Then they go on to say that these new teachers are not at fault for not knowing how to help struggling readers. It is the fault of their teacher credential program for failing at its job. There's a lot of harsh criticism, and some of it is probably justified. Some of it may not be. I was thinking just recently an event that happened to me that really underscored how challenging our work is preparing future teachers. When I was working in the Department of Ed Psych, I was probably at that point an assistant professor working with undergrads and graduate students in a special education program as well as school psychology. But we set up a program where our undergrad students did their basic coursework, and then before student teaching had to participate in a summer clinic. And we ran that summer clinic in collaboration with the local school district. So children came for a period of a few weeks where our teacher trainees from Texas A&M worked alongside the classroom teachers, the district teachers, and they had to show us that they were ready to go into student teaching. And not all of them did. We didn't allow them all to move on. But one of the memorable moments I had was we got the students all showed up, the teacher candidates, the student teachers, trainees, I guess we might call them. They had a term. I don't remember what we were using then. But I asked them all to get ready, that I had materials there available, that they were supposed to go right out into those classrooms, elementary classrooms, and sit down with a student and do some assessments so that we knew where those students were and we could start planning our instruction. And a fair number of those teacher trainees looked up at me like, you want us to go test students? How would we do that? We don't know how to test students. And the reason I remember that so much is because the semester before, I mean, literally about 2 weeks before this summer school, they had taken a course from me where I taught them how to do those assessments. I thought I taught them well. We did lots of practice. They went out and practiced with a student. If that didn't go well, I asked them to do it at least one more time. I trained them, and 2 weeks later, they said, "We've never received this training." So I've been there. I know how hard it is. We're asking these often very young people to learn a lot of things that is brand new to them. We're asking them to do a very challenging thing, and it's a challenging job for us too. But I want to start off our discussion for the remainder of our time together on a really positive note. I love this picture. I use it in a lot of my workshops because it demonstrates, keeps me grounded. This is what I want for all of our students to be able to read, enjoy reading. The whole process is beautiful, and this is the outcome we want. And there's so much good news for us to think about in terms, if that's our goal. We've got lots of good news, a lot of it coming from the research that is happening and has happened over the last several decades, but especially in the last 20 years, we've learned so much about best practices in teaching because we've learned so much more about how the human brain becomes a reading brain or doesn't. And this science has come from the medical side, which has studied the functions and structures of the brain. And then in the work that we do in psychology and education, so much learning and understanding, including one source of information that has come from a tool that didn't even exist more than 20 years ago. The ability, these tools, magnetic encephalography or functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRIs, we can now, for the first time, starting about 20 years ago, scan actively engaged brains non-invasively. That's really important because we had some technology before to look at brain functioning, but it was very invasive. The head had to be shaved, electrodes implanted in the scalp, that kind of thing. And parents, justifiably, would not allow their children to be involved in studies like that. Now, and you can see the top two pictures, there's a little girl. This is one of the very early studies, but you can see a little bit of her beautiful brown hair sticking out. She did not have to have her head shaved. It's not uncomfortable for her. And what she's doing is engaging in a literacy task, doing some kind of reading task while her brain is being scanned. And at the bottom, you see some of the more modern, evolved versions of those machines. These are two of the imaging machines from the lab of Dr. Nadine Gabb in Boston. So that work continues. And what these images have allowed us to see so clearly, and there's now quite an abundance of research using those images that have given us pictures like this, so that we can determine that these two children are at very different levels of risk for learning to read. These are both brain scans of two different 5-year-olds, neither of which neither of these two children already read. They're in a pre-reading stage, but when engaged in some kind of pre-literacy task, it might be a rhyming task or identification of which words are the same or different, so not involving reading at all. We can tell by the blood flow, and that's what these images are tracking, that the student on the left is not at risk for learning to read, where the student on the right is. And we know that by those blood flow patterns. The child on the left, we know, is not at risk because when engaged in a language-based pre-literacy task, that child's brain is automatically processing that information in the left hemisphere. That is the hemisphere that is neurologically, genetically, biologically evolved to process language. Whereas the student on the right is at risk because when engaged in exactly the same kind of auditory language-based pre-literate activity, their brains are trying to process language information in the right hemisphere, which is not the hemisphere that has the biologic, neurologic predisposition to be able to process that. But we have a lot of good news even around that because we know we can change those brains. One of the early studies that was done where we used the traditional kind of research model of testing some children, giving them a reading test first, and then doing an intervention, and then giving them a reading test at the end. These researchers did that with these students, but they also scanned their brains and scan their brains pre and post the intervention. One of the first studies to do that. They did an intervention with 8 students ranging from 7 to 17 years old, and spent a very intensive 8 weeks, 2 hours a day on a phonologically based intervention, very much a phoneme level intervention, very intensive. These children were all identified as having dyslexia. And what they found was that the children's reading improved over that 8 weeks, but they also found that the deficit in functional brain organization underlying their dyslexia, basically meaning at first these children were processing reading information in their right hemisphere. And after 8 weeks, about 2 months of sufficiently intensive intervention, those brain patterns were reversed. And one of the co-authors of this study talked about teachers being able to do brain surgery by instruction. And you may have seen these slides, and they've been around now for about 20 years old, but these were slides from that original study, one of the 15-year-olds and 10-year-olds. So before, the 15-year-old on the right, as you can see, is processing the information. The blood flow is happening in the right hemisphere. 8 weeks later, it's shifted to the left hemisphere, and the same for the 10-year-old on the right. What you see on the 15-year-old, there's still, even in that left hemisphere, there's a lot of area being activated, which means that brain is working really hard. But it's now working in the hemisphere that is more accommodating to those language tasks. But we would assume over time that area that indicates work would get smaller because the brain would be become more efficient in processing that information. And it's hard. Learning to read is a big deal. Marianne Wolf and many others, Stanislas Dehaene and Mark Seidenberg and others who study brain cognition are reminding us that our brains have not yet caught up to this linguistic challenge that we're asking them to do. We've been speaking. There has been human language in a verbal form for thousands of years, but reading is a relatively new invention, and our brains haven't yet caught up. And we know that reading is a highly complex task that involves lots of interconnected and codependent linguistic processes. And I've always been a fan of this chart because what this is a statistical modeling of the skills involved in becoming a skillful reader, published in the Scientific Studies of Reading. And I am not a statistician myself, so I don't really interpret as much as a trained statistician would do what all those numbers mean. Those are statistical weights of contributions of those components in this theoretical model to the outcome of reading comprehension. But what I love about this chart is it just shows how challenging learning to read and teaching someone to read is, especially when those people we're trying to teach to read, their brains are kind of fighting the process. They don't biologically, organically support the process. So what you're seeing here is at the far right, reading comprehension as being the outcome of all these component pieces. So because it's so complex, I am very grateful for the work of Goff and Tumner back in 1986, who proposed a simple way of looking at reading, not at all suggesting that reading is simple, but a simple way to view reading. And there are certainly others. Nell Duke just recently proposed a tweak to this model. I'm really fond of Malt Joshi's expansion of this model that he calls the computational model. So this was one of the early proposed models or theoretical ideas of how we should think about reading. But in all the future, the current definitions, they always refer to the simple view. We've expanded it and nuanced it a little bit, but it remains the centerpiece of understanding because it really is quite accurate. It's been shown over the decades of research that we do understand that reading comprehension is, in fact, the product of language comprehension, the ability to understand spoken language, and some process of decoding, the ability to figure out unfamiliar words and recognize sight words that have been orthographically mapped. So basically, the idea when applied to this image is to say, not that reading is simple, but we can take a simple view. We can say that reading comprehension is the outcome of language comprehension, the product of language comprehension and decoding activities. So it's just a simple view. And then I also am very grateful for the work of Hollis Scarborough with this brilliant infographic where she basically took the concept of the simple view of reading and deconstructed it a little bit, taking the idea of language comprehension and breaking it down into the component pieces that all must be there. So basically what she's doing is an infographic of that more complex modeling of reading. But essentially that's saying that reading comprehension, that imaged as a tightly woven rope, is the product of language comprehension and these components of language comprehension and word decoding. And it has to, all those components need to be there. They need to be woven together in a strategic way to help our students ultimately become skilled readers where they can fluently execute and coordinate all those component pieces. So the good news continues. We now can say, and many researchers are saying, that somewhere around, we're talking about human beings, so we never know the exact number, but somewhere around 95% of children can be taught to read by the end of first grade. And that those students who struggle with that are constrained only by their cognitive abilities, that we don't have the ability to change their listening comprehension and in their general cognition. So one of the handouts I sent you today is, I mean, I could call it an article, but it's just my, it's a living document. It continues to grow and change. So I updated it most recently last month. My conclusions from research, and I'm going to be sharing those with you today, as these studies come in to say over and over again, we can teach almost all children to read. I just keep a running record and tabulation of some of those studies and a statement of conclusion about that. And there's even more good news comes from the work of Sally Shaywitz and many, many others, that while yes, there is an optimal age for early reading intervention, it is never too late. We have a lot of good evidence, and I'm going to be talking later about those wonderful IES practice guides where people do so much of the hard work for us and go into the research and pull out the most practical ideas and put them in place. And so there is one of those IES practice guides for adolescent literacy. So much good news. And maybe we could just stop there and say, we figured this out. We know what we're doing. Almost all children can become these children, and it's all wonderful. But of course, we're here today in part because it's not. When we really look at the data, it's really impossible to not acknowledge that we're not anywhere near where we hope to be. From the US Department of Education just 3 years ago, tweeted this, that the US ranks 23rd in reading, 25th in science, and 40th in math, that 2 out of 3 of our 4th grade students can't read at grade level. 1/3, about 33% of our students at 4th grade can read at grade level. And these statistics don't really significantly change as the students get older. 1/3, rather than the 95% that the researchers are saying is possible. Researchers who study the brain, but also researchers who work in real world classrooms. So the Department of Ed says we can and we must do better, and we absolutely must. So I included in the handouts today too, to me, one of the most poignant reminders of how absolutely essential it is for us to get this right. I'm going to share with you a page out of a journal that a young man named Noah was required to write every day in his high school English class. He was 18 years old, a senior when he wrote this, reading at about the 4th grade level, spelling on a good day, maybe we could call it on the 3rd grade level. So I have this page from his journal because his mother brought it to a colleague of mine who is an internationally renowned researcher in the field of dyslexia, and Mom said, I don't want people to forget kids like Noah. So I'm going to show you this sample from his journal. His handwriting is very poor. His spelling, as you'll see, is very poor. So if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to read it to you because I've done the work to figure out what he was trying to say. Today, I was so embarrassed in English that I never want to go to English class again. When you said you were going to pass out the paper back out, I knew it was going to be bad. I can't figure it out, but the loudest kid in the class always gets my paper. She makes fun of my spelling and calls my name out in front of the whole class. Then she keeps pointing out my misspelled words, and all the kids around her laugh and look at me. This is not the first time I have been embarrassed in class. I hate popcorn reading, and I just sit there and freak out, and I can't listen to the story. And then a kid calls on me and I have to say pass or just turn red in my face. I hate English and hate thinking about it. These journals don't help me, and I hate doing them. I'm not going to be a writer as my job, so there's no point in it. Spelling and reading are my disabilities, and I get no help to get any better in it. The school doesn't help me, and that's why I hate it. And all the kids who laugh at me. School just hurts me. I get a reaction every time I read that because we failed Noah. And there's no point at all in pointing fingers and blaming people. It's simply a fact that this child, we failed this child, and he is not alone. There are hundreds or I don't know, millions of these children. We can and we must do better, as the Department of Ed said. We do have a national reading crisis, and I really appreciated this article in Ed Week, written by 3 district academic administrators from some of the very large school districts who wrote about this, basically in the article saying, we're in charge of reading in our districts. We were made we were put in these positions, all 3 of us, not knowing really anything about best practices in reading, not knowing the science of reading. And we were the leaders. And they said, though, that we slowly became aware that our teachers needed a whole lot more support, that we needed to change what we were doing. There was a lot of good stuff and brave stuff shared in this article. But what I really took away from it was this sentence that they wrote, that we should declare a no shame zone for this work, to make it safe for all educators to say, I have unfinished learning around literacy. And I have kind of made that my own motto, I guess, if you will. I feel that I am quite well. I've been very blessed and advantaged to have had access to great teachers. I have the time now, and my work is to learn as much as I can about literacy and sharing it with others. But I will tell you, every single week, my learning deepens and expands. I change the way I'm talking about things because I have a better understanding. We must all continue to bravely say we have unfinished learning around literacy and embrace the opportunities to continue to learn, I think. But I think it's reasonable to ask, why do we have a national reading crisis when we have so much great information out there, so much great research, some of which is relatively new, but why can't we get that into the classrooms? And there's many reasons. This is an ongoing topic of discussion among many people, but I was very impressed. I'm a big fan of the New Yorker magazine. It's one of my primary sources of information besides that's not professional information. But one evening I was reading an article in the New Yorker in 2019, an article written by an MD, a medical doctor, who shared his journey from being of continuing to be informed. So I want to read just a little bit from this article. He wrote, as a medical student, I was taught that peptic ulcers were often caused by stress. Treatments included bed rest and a soothing diet rich in milk. Anyone who suggested that ulcers were the result of bacterial infection would have been thought crazy. The prevailing view was that no bacterium could survive in the acidic environment of the stomach. But in 1982, two Australian researchers, who later won a Nobel Prize for their work, proposed that a bacterium was in fact crucial to the onset of many peptic ulcers. Although the hypothesis was met with widespread scorn, experimental evidence gradually became conclusive. Now ulcers are routinely treated with antibiotics. And I just resonated with that, because I think that that's partly, that kind of reflects where we are in our field, that we've got this information that much of what we're learning completely contradicts. It causes cognitive dissonance. It makes us say, that can't possibly be true. That just doesn't theoretically make sense. It doesn't align with my belief system, but it is true. Just like, how could bacteria cause peptic ulcers? There's no bacteria in the stomach. Well, turned out not to be true. So I think that notion that we are gradually coming to conclusions, and we have to abandon and let go of and maybe mourn the things that we used to do, because we now have compelling evidence. And this is what I include in that statement that I shared with you, that article. I believe we have sufficient compelling evidence from a wide convergence of research that reading is clearly indicating that approximately somewhere in the vicinity of 95% of all students can achieve literacy skills either at or very close to grade level. And these statistics include students with dyslexia or other learning disabilities. And I also included in the handouts today this. incredibly lovely infographic created by Nancy Young, who is Canadian and deeply involved, as we all are, in reading. And she put together, based on research about the general proclivity, general ability of students to become skillful readers. And that's what this infographic generally, in general, represents, is that we have a significant amount of research that lets us know that some children are going to find the acquisition of reading very easy, and some are going to find it very difficult. And she's put this in this easy to interpret infographic with very accurate, to the extent that we know today, accurate percentages to assign to those children at different levels of proclivity, ability to that they're very inarticulate here explaining this, how easy it's going to become for them to become readers. So she's identified about 5%, which is very much reflective in the research literature. 5% of children learn to read almost effortlessly. The researchers, those lucky researchers that work with those children, label those are generally called precocious readers. And you may have been one of those. You may have children who are that, or had them in your schools. It's an amazing process to watch them really become readers, often at age 4 and 5 years old. So that's about 5%. About 35% learn to read relatively easy with broad instruction, basically meaning we can teach them any way, any theory. We can use leveled readers, we can use systematic phonics. They're going to learn to read no matter what we do. So that leaves about 40 to 50%, the bulk of our students are going to learn to read. They can learn to read proficiently, but it is going to require code-based, systematic, explicit, sequential instruction, the kind of things that you've been studying in this work that you're doing in Ohio. And then we have about 10 to 15% of children that we would label as dyslexic, having word level reading difficulties. That number is not precisely defined. I'm working on another presentation right now that I'm going to be doing for school psychologists in Florida around dyslexia. And we're talking about that number. What is the percentage? But in general, across researchers, feeling comfortable, about 10 to 15% of our children have a neurological challenge that makes reading particularly difficult. And most of those children, especially if we catch them early, can be taught to read. Those are some of the students that remain our vulnerable readers, because if we do catch them early and give them that very high levels of support, they may read at grade level, but because they have dyslexia, they're going to be vulnerable readers throughout their reading. So our conversation today is really about these children, the vulnerable readers. But I do want to point out one thing. If we do believe, and I think we should, I certainly believe the numbers, the percentages here. If we take the kids in the green, 5% those precocious readers and 35% the kids who generally learn to read easily, and add those together, that's 40% of children. And we in the United States are about at 1/3 of our children reading at grade level. To me, that indicates that we may be doing something wrong. We're doing things that are holding some students back in too many classrooms, if that's true, because at least 40% should be able to read reasonably well, no matter what we do. We do know that early intervention is very important. One of the books that I have written on dyslexia, I quoted from a blog from Pamela Snow, who's a researcher in Australia, and she wrote that this powerful statement that effective early intervention is like building better fences at the top of the cliff rather than parking ambulances at the bottom. And she went on to be very clear that the best early intervention in reading is effective instruction. So those kinds of statements informed my conclusions about reading research. So I added that statement that students are most successful when they receive effective early intervention and instruction, but it's never too late to provide intervention. So this whole statement continues to reflect my conclusions from research. Research also says that this instruction that we should be doing must be provided by teachers who are both well-informed and well-supported. Our superstar teachers, what do we mean by well-informed? They should know about this scientific evidence. They should be informed that there is a knowledge base, and it's a knowledge base that is not static. It continues to grow. They need to be prepared to continue on their lifelong journey of learning about this complex thing called reading instruction, and continue to embrace that notion that they need to keep learning about the information as it comes out. Well-informed, they should have data. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but we want teachers to know who might need extra assistance, who are the vulnerable readers in their classroom, what kind of help do they need, and after instruction is happening, information about, so they can determine whether the work is working. If their hard work of teaching and the students' hard work of learning, is it making a difference? Are they moving in the right direction? Teachers also need to be well supported. And what do we mean by that? They need time. They need focused, intentional, scheduled time to do their work. And that may seem very obvious and straightforward, but it's often not available to our teachers. Their time is not as protected or supported as it should be. They should have the resources that they need, human resources, good curriculum materials, all of those kind of things, plus ongoing high quality and strategic professional development and learning. So that's what I'm meaning when I say well supported. And then I go on to say that the most powerful instruction that's going to make the big difference is comprehensive, systematic, explicit, intensive, multimodality, and informed by data. Whew, that's a big statement. So in the world, the reading world right now, those components are being discussed using an umbrella term of structured literacy. And I know that you've had conversations around this, so this is not a new term for you, but it's the easy, quick way to talk about comprehensive, systematic, explicit, intensive, multimodality instruction that is informed by data. So comprehensive is a very important aspect of effective instruction, including what we would call structured literacy. We need to be sure the instruction is addressing all the key standards that have been identified by research, so that all our students succeed. And I think this is a very important topic right now, because there's a lot out in the world where there's the reading wars alive and well, and people are accusing each other of things, and you're on one side or the other. There are people who very mistakenly talk about the science of reading people only care about phonics. And there is no one in the world who knows anything about reading at all who would say that it's all about phonics. What we do know, and there's a lot of discussion about phonics, because it is very important to get that one component of reading. It's very important to get that right. The kids at the bottom of Nancy's ladder, that's typically what they struggle with. The phonemic awareness, the phoneme awareness and phonics is what they struggle with. So those kids need lots and lots of work in that. But nobody is saying phonics only. It has to be comprehensive, and it has to cover all of our children, those children in who are responding to tier 1, or those who need some extra support. By systematic instruction, one component of structured literacy, a scope and sequence that is carefully defined and laid out, and lots of good examples and lots of reviews built in. So I think of systematic instruction as a characteristic of the curriculum we use. It's not so much how we teach, it's the materials we use have been pre-planned to be systematic, that kindergarten aligns with first grade aligns with second grade, and all of those align with standards. And those are the tools that teachers use. Whereas explicit instruction is more of the delivery of instruction that research has shown is more effective. We've referred to explicit instruction often as using a gradual release of responsibility, but we often talk about explicit instruction as being delivered in 3 steps: demonstration, showing the students what you want them to do, guided practice, and ultimately independent practice. But these days, as the research expands, there's discussion now about possibly including another step in that may be certainly advantageous for some students when done well. So we do the first step, the I do step, the guided practice, the we do step, ultimately the independent practice, the you do step, but another step added in there, which we might refer to as the y'all do step, where the students get to collaborate together. And I know in my work in schools, having the teachers do that demonstration and guided practice in small groups, having kids after they have been launched in some basic skills can have tremendous advantage from working together in a collaborative manner. But ultimately, of course, we need students to show that they can do it by themselves. And this work really needs to happen across all the grade levels. I've used this model of explicit instruction from preschool through graduate school, high school, and above, where our students get the explicit instruction they need, whole group and small group, collaborative practice, and then independent practice. Intensive instruction, and I would say in my visits to classrooms, my peeking in on classrooms over the last year and a half through Zoom or Teams, this is what I see lacking in a lot of classrooms, is a sense of intensity, the notion of urgency, a sense of no wasted time, using a perky pace in the instruction, lots of active engagement requiring frequent responses from our students with a really clear purpose. What are we doing with this half hour, 45 minutes? And work in small groups, which allows that focus to happen. We're going to really spend some time working on some morphographs that the other students have mastered, or vice versa, and a sense of relentlessness, no excuses, rather than saying, oh, well, that child has dyslexia, or that child's in special ed, and that's not really my responsibility. We need this intensity if we're going to reach those goals of 95%. And in order to do that, to manage and organize the classroom, in order to provide that kind of instruction at preschool or early elementary or junior high or high school, there's a lot of tools and procedures that we need to have in place that I didn't learn in my training, but I connected at one point in my career with Vicki Gibson, another one of those colleagues that come your way and teach you so much. Vicki and I worked together at Texas A&M University, and Vicki ran a school that I went to visit near the Texas A&M campus, and it was a preschool. And I watched her using a classroom management system where the preschool children, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, were working with a small group, might be working with a teacher doing very age-appropriate activities. But all the other 3- and 4-year-olds were at different places in the classroom doing productive, engaged activities. And it just astounded me. So Vicki went on to write some books about her management strategy, both for preschool. The one with the purple title there is preschool, and the blue title is elementary. And I know there's one for middle school and high school in the works. I also just recently heard more about the wonderful work happening at the Iowa Reading Research Center, a enormous wealth of information, very practical. They do research there at the center, but spend a lot of time translating their research and making it accessible to all of us. So recently, I just heard that the research center had been working with a school in Iowa that had been very highly challenged. Talk about a school of vulnerable readers. And for many years, they had not been successful. So they partnered, the research center partnered with this school. And over a period of time, the students started meeting those goals of close to 95% of kids reading on grade level. And they opened that school as a model school so people could come and see what they were doing. And what I heard was the biggest question over and over was, how do you organize small group instruction? How do you do that? What are the other kids doing? All of that. So they put together this module, which I have to say, I just heard about this a couple of weeks ago. I have not yet taken the training, but I intend to, because I want to fill my basket with ideas and strategies for best practices in small group instruction. When we talk about that component of structured literacy being informed by data, we know that we have better outcomes when teachers make their decisions based on good data. And the research indicates that data are really to answer these key questions. Who are the kids who need the help? What kind of help do they need? And then monitoring their progress. So up front, before instruction, answering who needs the help, what help do they need, on an ongoing basis is the working. And we are going to, toward the end of my time with you today, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that. So one component of structured literacy is that notion of multimodality instruction. And this is a term, and you may have noticed that this is a term that's being used more and more in literacy instruction to replace an older term of multisensory. And in my reading of the research, often this is research that has been done with children with learning disabilities and dyslexia, that the reason for the change in terminology is that historically, the work around what is most effective for students with dyslexia, those early researchers, decades and decades, maybe nearly 100 years ago now, found that children with dyslexia can be taught to read, write, and spell, but it was helpful for them to not just be presented with the information in a more traditional way that works for our neurotypical children, but they needed multi-sensory supports. And some of those were interpreted as things like writing in the air, or tracing sandpaper letters, or shaving cream, or rice kernels, or those kinds of things. And what we have found as we looked more critically and using more sophisticated research methodologies, that it really wasn't the multisensory aspect of those things that worked. It was the fact that children were seeing, hearing, speaking, and engaged in a kinesthetic way with their work. So taking away the sandpaper and the rice and the shaving cream, and simply making sure that all of our students are using all their sensory modalities, but all of them should be directly related as close as possible to the actual task of reading, the actual task of writing and spelling. And we have learned that that is the most effective. And so it is included as the term multimodality within the definition of structured literacy. And a shift that's also been happening when we talk about structured literacy is when we do talk about phonics. There's wide agreement that systematic, explicit instruction in phonics is important, but we are beginning to move away from a more traditional way of teaching phonics, starting with the letters and having the students read those letters, blend those letters, and then produce the word. The research is indicating that if we flip this process and activate the speech and language first, and then connect it with the print, that many of our students do better with that. So a quick kind of overview, because I know that you've had work in this area, but my interpretation of this and an example of how that might look in pre-K and kindergarten, if I were teaching students the word mug. So I would start with the speech. I would start with the language. I would activate the meaning aspect. So my children are not seeing anything, my little pre-K, kindergarten, first grade students, I'm saying, we're going to learn the word mug today. So I want you all to say mug. So the students would activate, they would be actively engaged. They would activate their language around mug with a choral unison response. If, as I would likely in all classrooms these days, have some students in there who are English learners. They don't know what the word is. They're being fully supported here. They don't need to know what the word is. They're not being called out individually, but they're getting a chance to practice the word. If I had a lot of children who are English learners, I might do this step multiple times. Say mug, mug, let's say mug again. And then because I want to make all things reading as meaning-based as possible, my students might not know what a mug is. So I would have been prepared to bring mugs of different colors and different sizes and talk about what we do with the mug. And oh, look, here's a really big mug, and spend some time. We have to always care for the time that we're spending, but for some students, just talking about what a mug is, passing them around, having that discussion. Then we bring in the phonological awareness with some kinesthetic activities. We've taught them how to clap syllables before, so we ask the students, clap for the syllables in mug. How many syllables in mug? They clap one time, they're engaged. We do some segmenting with the kinesthetic. How many sounds in mug? Ugh. Let's say the sounds in mug, and I can hold up 3 fingers. I can hold up popsicle sticks. I might use sound boxes. Now let's say the word together. We blend the sounds into mug. They're still not seeing it yet. Now we connect that phoneme awareness with phonics, first reminding of the sounds you hear at the beginning, the end, the middle, and then bringing in the graphemes and the letters and showing them that. Then I would have my students have a kinesthetic opportunity for the multimodality instruction. They would have whiteboards or some written activity with a paper and pencil, depending on their age, and providing the scaffolding as needed. So some of my students would have a blank whiteboard and a pen, and I would just have them write an on your whiteboard. Write an on your whiteboard, write a g on your whiteboard. You wrote an M, a U, a G. Some of my students would have a pre-prepared, and it would always be in front of them. I don't want them to guess. Even for all my students, there would be an example of an M, a U, and a G in front of them. For some of my students, though, might have a piece of paper or a whiteboard where mug is already written and they simply have to trace. Others might have varying levels of scaffolding for that, but I want all my students to do it correctly and successfully. Then if they've written MUG, I can ask them to decode that word. Then we, if they're ready, we can do some advanced phoneme manipulation, erase the G on the word you just wrote and make a D. Again, fully supported. Here's an example of a D. Here's how you trace the D, and then read the new word, and then we can continue that connection with language about mud. And we can do the same thing for our older students all the way through the grade, something like a multisyllable word, oral, activating the speech first, the language transformation, clapping out the syllables, talking about the morphology. Trans means across, over, or through. Form means to shape. A shun, action or process. Transformation, the action or process of changing shape. All the cool, fabulous, fascinating stuff we can do with morphology. So back to Nancy Young's ladder, where she points out for these students at the different levels of ease for which reading they're going to acquire reading, message being all these children can get to the top of that literacy ladder, or at least the science says we can hope for all, we can aim for all. The science says about 95% of our students can get there. But what the science also says is that when we use that structured literacy approach, that it really is essential for these children at the bottom. This is where we're going to get close to 95%, is making sure that we're using some version of that structured literacy, that multifaceted components with these students. We have lots of evidence that that's true. We have less evidence, but I find it fascinating that when researchers have applied structured literacy to the children who are already going to become readers, no matter what we do, they do even better. This 40% of kids that will learn to read completely on their own or with practically anything we do, when we use structured literacy with them, they are better readers, they are better writers, they are better spellers. And that's pretty amazing. So yeah, some of our students are simply going to climb more easily than others. So to finish my statement, my conclusions about reading research, the final statement would be that this high impact instruction is designed to appropriately integrate those components of oral language development. We can think back on Scarborough's rope or the simple view of reading, that statistical modeling of reading. There must be oral language development. There must be phoneme awareness and phonics. Both the decoding and the encoding that really helps our children become skillful with phonics and ultimately spelling. Fluency, vocabulary, those key reading comprehension skills and strategies, plus the content knowledge, which we know people like Natalie Wexler and others have helped us remember how critically important. We can't just teach the skills without the content to understand. So we have reached the point in my presentation here today that I would like to take a little break from talking and allow you to talk. So I've worked with Stanley in the background to give you the opportunity to be in some groups with your colleagues. We're going to spend about 10 minutes with this activity. Some of the things I've covered a lot, but just as a reminder, that concept, I believe, well supported in research, that 95% of our students can be taught to read, that early intervention is critically important, structured literacy, and a bunch of other stuff that I talked about. So you can use your 10 minutes to introduce yourselves to your group. You're going to have at least one more opportunity to meet with this group a little later this morning. But we'll do the 10 minutes now, Stanley, if you're ready. Welcome. I hope that was a good opportunity for you to engage with your colleagues. And I had a bit of a time to read some of the comments in the chat while you were doing that. And there were several people reflecting on that truly heart-wrenching story of Noah. I feel so grateful for that. I get an emotional I've read it, I don't know how many hundreds of times, but it gets me every time because I never knew that young man. I didn't even meet his mother, but yeah, it just reminds me of just a good reminder, I think, for all of us. If there were any burning questions, I'm hoping at the end that we will have some time for general questions, but if you care to, if you have something you'd like to share or a question for me, we could take a minute or two here. You can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question before we continue. Okay, let's go ahead and continue then. When we talk about all this stuff like research and you know, our newer thinking and we're not doing very well, I think for me, I'm an extremely practical person, and I always want to know, can we really do this in the real world? Or is this just something we ivory tower people talk about and write articles about? But it's important to me to at least contemplate, can we do this in the real world? I think that's a very fair and important question. And the answer is yes. Is it easy? No. Is it often done? No. And one of the challenging aspects about it is even when we do find the right place and the right time and the right people to make it work, sustaining that change is extremely hard. But I want to spend at least some time talking about good news today. So I may have mentioned I live in Seattle, so I'm a few hours earlier than you. And not only do I regularly read professional journals and the New Yorker magazine, our local newspaper, the Seattle Times, has some really excellent education reporters. And back in 2014, they wrote this article that I love sharing because it just captures the reality of what can be done in a school. And the numbers align exactly with what the research says we can do. So back in 2014, a school in Auburn, Washington, which is a small, economically challenged, it was a lumber community, and lumber is just a really challenged economic system these days. And it was one of the state's poorest schools, Hildo Ray in Auburn. The reporter found this school because he had been looking in the publicly available data for schools who had moved from low performing to high performing. That was what he was looking for. And he found Hildo Ray that back in 2001 had registered, its students were lower than the state average, which is the gray line there. They were lower. The percentage at Hildo Ray of students with free and reduced lunch was nearly 50% and climbing higher and higher and higher. At the time he did his article, 88% free and reduced lunch. But what caught his eye was the growth in academic performance. While the poverty rates were increasing, these students got to 94.9% in math and reading across the first 3 grades. And you take 94.9 and not being a mathematician, but I can round that up to there's that magical 95%. So the reporter, and do remember, this is not a professional article. This is the wording of an educational reporter and the thinking of an educational reporter. So this was back in spring of 2013, 531 students, about close to 90% poverty, close to 40% English learners, majority Latino. So that's a sense of the demographics of this group. So what happened? Well, they got a new principal, leadership, who brought some reading expertise to the table. She had been a former reading coach. And the reporter said she started off with behavior, that was his term, then focused on reading and then focused on math. The principal was described as charming but unrelenting. The reporter noted that there was a lot of collaboration going on and that it was mandated that the teachers met regularly. They jointly planned lessons, looked over the student work. They frequently assessed students, and they adjusted the curriculum, is what the reporter said. I think more likely adjusted the instruction on a weekly basis and sometimes even daily. There was a sense of urgency. One of the teachers said that they didn't have, we don't have a minute to waste because these kids are behind. They conducted their class at a quick clip, is what the reporter noted. A lot of the instruction was done in small groups, and they very conscientiously put the most experienced teachers with the most vulnerable students, which doesn't always happen. And the reporter noted that when the principal came in and mandated small groups, that was on the graph where you saw the initial jump. They went right to 80% just by putting kids in small group instruction, and then clawed their way from 80% up to that 95%. And I think anybody looking at that should be impressed. But then, okay, how do we take that into schools other than Hilda Ray that clearly had this amazing principal at the helm? What I've been advocating to people for a very long time is let's just copy. We certainly don't have time to waste. This is complex, tough stuff. School organizations, schedules, resources. There's not enough time. There's not enough money. There's not enough people. Let's just find the schools like Hilda Ray and copy what they were doing. So I've advocated for doing that for a long time, and we do have some good models to copy. There is a body of research out there that is generally referred to as effective schools research. And if you ever feel like you're getting burned out or discouraged, you want to just cheer yourself up. Go read some of this effective schools research, because it's always studies that talk about highly effective schools. That's what the research is all about. The schools vary tremendously. They're urban schools, they're high schools, they're rural elementary schools, suburban schools. So the schools really vary, but in order to be researched, they have to be determined to be highly effective. And in the research literature, that's generally referred to as a school that has achieved across the board at least 90% academic success. And there are a lot of schools who have done that, who are at 95% or higher academic success, who have only a few challenges. They're not a high poverty school. They're not a high mobility school. They are well resourced. Those are not the schools that are written about in effective schools research, because really it's wonderful that if you have a low challenge school, you should be at 90%. Nobody really wants to study how you got there. This research is really these schools like Hilda Ray, high poverty, high mobility, high diversity, all of these things, probably high mobility as well, these things that create challenges and yet achieve highly effective schools. How do they do that? Well, many years ago, in two different studies, my colleague Carolyn Denton and I did a review of the effective schools research, really trying to come up with a guideline. I mean, how can we copy these schools? What are they doing? And we encountered, drum roll, 5 components that we saw from this research, no matter if it was an urban high school or a suburban junior high or a rural elementary school. These schools were always doing these 5 amazing things. And of course, they're not that amazing. Really, it's hard to find a school that isn't attending to standards, isn't collecting assessment data. All schools focus to some extent on instruction and intervention. We hope that there's leadership and a sustained commitment. So it's not just that these things are in place. You have to take these things. And of course, from these components, we created this acronym of SAILS, which you can then come up with all kinds of cheesy sayings like set your sails for success. So it's not just that these things are in place, but the effectiveness, the level of focus. And for our time today, I'm not going to go over all of these in detail. I'm going to give you some resources if you want to know a little bit more, but I'm going to focus in on a quick overview of the assessments and intervention conclusions that Carolyn and I drew from the effective schools research. So these highly effective schools, when looking at the assessments that they do, they screen their students, they do some diagnostic data collection, they do progress monitoring or continuously evaluating. And of course, they then measure the outcomes. But again, almost all schools are doing that. And we can see from the reporter report on Hilda Ray that they were doing that too. Yeah, they tested their students frequently. But one of the things we noticed from our review of research that what differentiated these schools, the reason that made them effective was not just data collection. It was that they seemed to understand that assessments have a purpose. And the real purpose underlying all valuable assessments is that you've picked the right assessment to answer a specific question, and you've picked the assessment to answer that specific question as quickly and efficiently as possible. So that's what we saw in the effective schools. Yeah, they did benchmark screening, but they knew that the purpose of benchmark screening is to figure out as quickly and efficiently as possible who is it that needs our help? Who might be our vulnerable readers? We don't wait for them to fail. We actively go looking for them. Then once we found a student who might be vulnerable, we teachers, not school psychologists or diagnosticians or the $2,000 an hour cognitive psychologists in private practice, but the teachers are informed and supplied and supported with informal diagnostic tools that can answer the question, what help do they need? Okay, they are not at benchmark, but what is it that we should spend our time teaching? And then these schools start the teaching and they bravely and honestly start questioning, is the work working? And then all states require some kind of outcomes assessment. And it's really the differentiator again in assessments are these, the benchmark screening, the diagnostic, and the progress monitoring to help us determine, to answer the questions that helps keep us moving. The other thing though, that the highly effective schools do with all this data is that they actually use it. They share it in regular meetings that have a collaborative tone. They are open, public, meaning it's not just the first grade teacher sits down with her data. It's all the first grade teachers and a cross grade levels team. And it has to be non-judgmental. This is not about finding the good teachers and the bad teachers. This is looking for kids like Noah. This is kid level decision. We're not meeting Noah's needs. What can we do differently? I need an idea. I'm doing the very best I can. I don't know what else to do. And then we all collaborate to figure out what can be done differently. So we don't have children ending up in high school like him. So these highly effective schools regularly share their data and then they use them. They use the results to change what they're doing or to decide to continue what they're doing if it's working. And that's what Hilda Ray did. They adjusted their curriculum at least weekly and sometimes daily if it wasn't meeting the needs of their students. When Carolyn and I reviewed this research looking for ideas to copy on instruction and intervention, we found three big ideas. And the first of which has to do with classroom organization and management. It is a hugely missing piece. I would love to have further discussions with all of you about this, but when I see novice beginning teachers out in the classroom, they may have a wealth of information about what to teach. But if they don't know how to set up, organize, and manage the classroom, they can't use that teaching. This really comes first. It is the first thing that needs to be in place, which is why I think that principal at Hilda Ray started with what the reporter called behavior, setting up classroom management. She said she mandated small groups right away. If these teachers didn't know how to set up small groups effectively, how to manage the behavior of the kids who weren't in the small group, that's what this principal focused on first. And that's what the research says must come first. Then planning the lessons that are differentiated to meet the identified needs, because you have that diagnostic data of all the students, the kids in the green at the top of the ladder and our most severely dyslexic students. Our obligation is to all of those students, acknowledging we don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough people, but we're going to be intensive and relentless and do the very best we can. And that, again, is what Hilda Ray was doing. The teachers collaboratively planned those lessons and figured out what to do for all of the students. And then the third thing that Carolyn and I found from our review of the research was, of course, then we come to the delivery. Once we've done all that work, then we can use that explicit systematic instruction with intensity, using the strategies that you taught them at their university and that they continue to learn and develop in professional development. We hope that they have a good supportive literacy coach there too. We hope that they have the right materials that allow them to meet the needs of all their children. And that's what we talked about, what we identified from the research, but also again, what was seeming to go on at Hill Do Re, that there was the small group instruction, the most experienced teachers working with the groups that needed the most help. But however, we know for sure that it's not all about academics. The sales model is primarily about academics. How do we achieve academic success? Through focus on standards, assessment, instruction, and intervention, supported by leadership and sustained commitment. But that isn't enough. We have to launch that sailboat, if you will, in a safe and tranquil harbor, if you want to think about it that way. So certainly at least some attention being paid every day for every child to their social emotional learning. And this comes from science. This is not just something that we deeply caring teachers know to be true. There is a growing body of evidence that suggests if we want many more children to lead fulfilling and productive lives, we cannot just focus on academics. We have to pay attention to issues that these children face, the toxic stress of poverty and abuse that some of these children are facing, that activate, I mean, we know neurologically, we know because of research that those stressors in all human beings activate the brainstem, which puts us into fight, flight, or flee modes. That's biological. We can't undo that without active attention to it. When we're in a toxic stress situation, the executive function is disrupted. And that really has a direct impact on academics, because the executive function is our memory, our attention, and our cognition. If our children are toxically stressed, we have to pay attention to it. We have to address the universal needs of helping them feel competent. How can we make them feel competent? Which was, thinking about Noah again, he was writing in that journal every day, and the teacher sharing his writing with other students every single day, his competence, because he said, I can't do this. I can't read, I can't write. And it's being put on display. We've got to be sure that we find every student. And Noah was also reported by his mother to be a gifted student as well. So surely there was some way that we could tap into his competence, give him an opportunity, as all children, to have some autonomy to control their environment, which is one of the things I love about the model that I talked about before, Vicki Gibson's model of classroom organization. The children spend a significant amount of time, whether they are 4 years old or 14 years old, on their own. They have to make good choices, or that autonomy gets taken away from them. But if they make good choices, a lot of their day is filled with choice and self-actualization, if you want to take it that way. And then that sense of community, which for the last 18 months has been extremely challenging for many of our schools and our students, is how do you create a sense of belonging when children are at their in my case, their grandmother's dining room table, doing third grade over a computer. But some teachers are doing it. My grandson's third grade teacher did an extraordinary job of creating a sense of community with those children that she never got to see face to face for this entire year. There's lots of good research and resources to support your work in this area. An article from the New York Times on empathy and resilience some resources for social and emotional learning. There was a federally commissioned report, much like the National Reading Panel report from the Aspen Institute. This is in your handouts, and that's free and available. Our work on the sales model was adopted by the state of Washington and put into a comprehensive, it was the framework for their comprehensive literacy plan, and that is still available. It was written quite a while ago, and because of changes in the state superintendent, it is no longer used as the comprehensive literacy plan. So if you go and look at it, it has the word draft written all over it because it was never fully implemented. And that really goes to that final component of sustained commitment. It's one of the hardest things we do in education is sustained commitment, even when things are working really, really well. And that's the follow-up to the story of Hilda Ray, is that for whatever reason, I don't know, because I worked hard to try to meet that principal, but I never did. And she's not at the school anymore. I don't know if she chose to leave or was given a different assignment. I have no idea what happened, but you can look at Hilda Ray's academic achievement when she was there, and it went right back down when we didn't sustain that commitment in a change of leadership. Another handout that I gave you was the with an outline, 2-page outline of the sales model in the format of a needs assessment. So we took all of the components and broke them down a little bit, kind of like Scarborough's rope, detailed them a little bit, and then put it in this format of a needs assessment. So you could be thinking about whether a school that you were working with or a classroom was at doing things really well in terms of standards. So the need there was very low, or there was some need for work on standards, or it wasn't being attended to at all or used effectively. That would be a high need. So that's explaining one of the handouts that you have. So our next time for a little reflection, what we've talked about in this interim piece is the sales model and the components. The one story that I have to bring with you of a real world application of Hilda Ray, and of course, anything else that you might like to chat about with your colleagues. This time we're going to do 6 minutes together, and then we'll come back and continue our conversation. So Stanley, you can take it away. Welcome back, everybody. Hope that was helpful. And again, I'll take a minute here. We're getting close to our break time, precious break time. But if anybody has a comment or a question, if you want to unmute. Again, I read some of the comments in the chat. Appreciate your thinking and expanding of the ideas that I've shared. So if you have a question or comment now that you'd like to share, I'm happy to engage with you on that. Or we will continue. So that sales model, and again, my interest is really making sure that we can apply thinking that comes from research into real world practice. In the introduction, I heard mention of one of the books that I've written called Educators as Physicians. It's how we as professional educators, much of our work as we're getting better and better tools and understanding about how to use data to guide our decision making, how much of our work does parallel the work that physicians have been doing for a very long time. I'm not sure it's that book currently is out of print, but I'm working on an update and revision of that this time with a co-author. I'm just such a, I benefit so much from collaboration, and I'm so grateful that Margaret Goldberg, whose work you may know, she's very busy out in California with the Right to Read project and does trainings and professional development all around the country. When she's not doing, working as a first grade teacher this year virtually from her home, Margaret and I are going to update that book on helping teachers, administrators collect and use reading data to inform their decisions. So what I want to do, and we will include in that book, I'm sure, what I'm about to share with you, and we'll discuss this after the break, but a guide for implementation of basically all I've shared with you today, that I used in another book that I wrote in another collaboration. I was very, very grateful to engage in ongoing collaboration with my friend and colleague, Deb Glazer. And I hope that you know her work. She was one of the original developers and trainers for the Letters program. She also now has created a set of tools on her own for online training called the Reading Teachers Top 10 Tools, and a myriad of other things that Deb does. So we collaborated to write a book on reading fluency, and both agreed in that book that we wanted to include as a framework for thinking about implementation of effective instruction. And of course, in this book, Reading Fluency, the effective instruction was very focused on helping students become fluent readers. But we included the outcomes-based model that was developed by Roland Good and colleagues at the University of Oregon. So this is what we're going to talk about when we return from break. And you have I think I included a PDF of this model. It's certainly in the handouts. That we start with identifying students who are at risk. That's the number one, or the students who might be vulnerable, the term we're using here today. The second step then is to answer so that first step is really the question of which students need help, who needs help. Step two is what kind of help do they need, and planning the instruction to address those needs. Step three is the key to this whole thing. It's the I in the sales model, the instruction and intervention, the implementation of the plan, which takes us and should take teachers. So the point of this model is to give teachers a framework for thinking about how they move through their instructional planning. But step four, as we are engaged in instruction, we do monitor the progress of our students. Are they meeting the identified goals that we have for them? And then step five, in response to that progress monitoring, we either make changes because they're not making sufficient progress, or we continue with the plan because they are. So, and we know that Good et al. Did not completely invent this out of whole cloth. There are many other frameworks like this, but this matches nicely with our interpretation of the data on using database decision making, and aligns well with how we wanted to talk about this. So I'm going to stop here now then. We'll have a slightly extended break. I have to look at the time zones because it's approaching 9:30 out here in Seattle. For you guys, it's getting close to 12:30. So we will come back at 1 o'clock to wrap up this discussion and have some time for questions. So be thinking about if you do have any questions or comments or insights. I look forward to hearing them when before we wrap up today. So have a good break.
This morning's presentations were absolutely amazing. And I'd like to reintroduce Dr. Jan Hasbrock for our last hour with her. Thank you so much for everything. It was moving and educational all-in-one. So without further ado, Dr. Jan Hasbrook.
Thank you. So let's continue this conversation. Stanley, can you confirm that my slide is up? And
it is not up right now. I probably went away when I put up the lunch slide, and you'll have to reshare.
Okay, thank you. It's always good to double check these things.
Looks good now.
Okay. Now I'll see if I can see it. Still looks good?
Yes, it does.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, let's continue. I'll put all you lovely people over to the side so I can see my screen. All right, so we're going to walk through this model, connecting what I shared this morning. And I'm hoping this is a helpful framework for you in your thinking, and certainly perhaps spur some conversation or some questions if you have any. So we start with making sure that we are attending to the fact that in every classroom, there are going to be some students who are going to be vulnerable. Commonly used term at risk. We know there are ways to, as we started way back earlier, there are ways to identify at-risk brains using brain scan technology, which is not something that we have down in the health room at schools these days. Those are multi-million-dollar machines. And what we know from the research of Nadine Gabb and many others who are using that technology is that that's one way of looking at an at-risk brain, but there are ways that we as professional educators without multi-million-dollar machines can identify which of those students likely have some brain disorders that make them vulnerable learners, or they have issues around their language development or language delay or other factors. And we can do that determination without neuropsychologists and magnetic encephalography machines or spending lots of time doing these assessments. That's very important to me too, because when we think about, if you go back to the sales model, that idea that there are many things that need to be in place to have a highly successful school, but the main one is that instruction and intervention. So in a world where we as professionals truly never have enough time or people or resources, we need to be sure that we're being very strategic with all our assessments. We need to collect assessment data, but we should spend minimum time doing it. And therefore, we should be very strategic and smart about what assessments we're using. So step one, making sure we know where all of our students are on that ladder of readiness to learn to read. We start with the screening assessments, and I use this little diagram as a way to show the flow chart of how a screening assessment is typically used effectively in those highly effective schools, generally doing a universal assessment. And really here I'm talking mostly about elementary schools. The need for screening all students really diminishes as we have much more evidence about who children are. We've got years of grades. They've taken state assessments. We can often use something other than a universal screener once we get students in 4th grade and above. But if that's something you want to chat about, we certainly can. But certainly in kindergarten through 3rd grade at minimum, 3 times a year at minimum, we want to screen all of our students using some kind of assessment that compares a student as quickly, efficiently as possible to an established benchmark that is an indicator of risk factor for essentially for comprehension. That's the concern that we have. Is this student on track for acquiring the skills that they will need to be able to read, write, and spell at grade level. So we could administer that benchmark screener to all students and determine whether that score of the student is at or above a predetermined benchmark, or slightly below the benchmark, or significantly below the benchmark. And what we have from the science of benchmark screening is if a student is at or above benchmark, we can make the conclusion that they are likely on track. And I am pausing for effect there, because one of the challenges I see, the misunderstandings that I see frequently in schools who are using benchmark screeners, and they may be using a good benchmark screener, but they mistakenly believe that those benchmark screeners are definitive, that they tell you whether a student is fine or not fine, not at risk or at risk. And often those assessments are 60-second assessments that simply don't have that kind of precision. They're not designed to do that. They're designed to put kids in more general categories. If they are well above benchmark and you have no other concerns about the student, you can definitely conclude that they are very likely on track. And for those kids, oh, well, I forgot, we want to be sure we're always addressing a question. And the question of benchmark screening is, who needs help? So for the ones who are likely on track, we put them in tier 1 level of instruction and watch them and monitor their progress and make sure that they stay on track. For the students who are slightly or significantly below, it is very likely that they would benefit from some extra assistance. But that's where we are at the end of benchmark screening, because that takes us then in the outcome-based model to step 2, which is a really important step that we take, that highly effective schools take, which is another round of assessments. And these are separated from the assessments in step 1, the benchmark assessments, for 2 reasons. One is that the purpose is completely different. They're designed to answer a completely different question. And we do not do step 2 assessments, diagnostic assessments, as we're talking about now. We do not use those universally. We don't take the time to do these assessments with all of our students, typically only the ones who did not meet benchmark, or we have some concern about, professional concern, because those benchmark assessments are not infallible. They miss some kids, or they identify some kids as being at risk who are not. So we always have to use our professional judgment. But diagnostic assessments in reading, we're looking at these things. We should have, all of our teachers should be well equipped with informal but reliable and valid tools that are quick and efficient to assess all of these things as our concerns about them arise. So we want assessments of these component pieces that we individually administer to students based on our concern. I wouldn't do a listening comprehension assessment for a student with high verbal acuity who have no concerns about their language proficiency or linguistic comprehension or language comprehension. I wouldn't do assessment for everybody. I might do an assessment of automatic word recognition. How has the student started to develop a lexicon of instantaneously recognized words that have been orthographically mapped? I might do that with some students and not others. So we do individualize. And the question for these diagnostic assessments is to answer this question: what help do they need? Do they need help with developing their language? Do they need help with developing sight words? Do they need help with phoneme awareness? And in order to be very strategic about that, I created this diagnostic assessment sequence, or flow chart, I sometimes refer to it. And I put a copy of this as a PDF in your handouts as well. Not a lot of rigorous science behind this. It's more just my many many decades now of work with schools and with children, and trying to be as organized and strategic as I can. So what I have found is that for our youngest students in K and 1, I will start at the bottom of this flow chart. And for these children, remember, I'm only assessing kids for whom I already have some concerns. I'm concerned about where they are in the at-riskness. Are they vulnerable or not? So typically I am going to do an assessment of phoneme awareness. I'm going to check their established set of high frequency words as mapped sight words. I have found doing a simple encoding spelling assessment can be very informative for children. Have they developed a phoneme mapping? Are they able to isolate phonemes in a word? This flow chart would guide me to say, if they're not where I would expect them to be in these really basic essential skills, phoneme awareness, some sight words, some ability to spell at a developmentally appropriate level. I mean, not end of year kind of level. I'm going to stop assessing. That's the real point of this flow chart, is to keep the assessments focused and not do more assessments than we need. So I'm going to stop assessing and start teaching. I'm going to use the rest of my time for teaching. If they don't know their letter names, I'm going to teach their letter names. If they don't have not acquired the phonemes I need them to have learned, I'm going to teach that, and then the mapping of the phoneme awareness to the graphemes. And then, of course, if during my assessments language was a concern, or perhaps before these assessments, this is really, I would also check language as appropriate. So I would just put that there. For our older students, and of course, older, we're talking about those old 7-year-olds, not very old, but once they're in second grade, I flip the sequence of this assessment and start with some kind of text reading. That's what I mean by an informal reading inventory. I want students to have a piece of text in front of them. It may be in the format of a little book. It may be just a photocopied story or passage that I want them to read. I want to give them a chance to read for more than 60 seconds. I want to watch all of their reading strategies and how well they perform. I'm going to hope to see if they can read grade level text. But if I'm assessing, for instance, a 5th grader, and I already know that this 5th grader is reading at about the 2nd or 3rd grade level, which is not untypical or atypical for our vulnerable readers, I would start with lower passages and stop when the passages get too difficult. So it's a generally recognized process of IRIs, informal reading inventories, but I put the word modified there because I have not found a published informal reading inventory that I use as designed. I try to keep in mind, and when I'm working with teachers, I often talk about this, that those, if you're using a published informal reading inventory, pay attention to the fact that it is an informal reading inventory, that even though it may have cost you, well over $100 and there's lots of stuff in there, it doesn't mean you have to do all of that. Pre-read or read silently or do a retell and then answer some questions and then do a written retell. I mean, you can go on and on and on. What I like to do, my modification, is strip all that stuff away, have students read a passage. If it's too easy, I stop them and move them to a more difficult passage. Once it gets to their really challenged frustration level, I stop. I do check their fluency, and in the true expanded understanding of fluency, their accuracy, their rate or automaticity, and their prosody or expression. So I'm listening for all of that as we're reading. Then I use that to make my decision about further assessments. If my student that I'm assessing, 2nd grader, 5th grader, 10th grader, turns out to be able to read and understand grade level text fluently, I stop my assessment. I don't need any more information. That's great. So I then continue instruction based on those assessment results. And that happens sometimes. I'm testing the student because they didn't do well on the benchmark screener, but they just didn't do well on the benchmark screener, but they are able to handle grade level text. More often, I am testing students who are struggling with grade level text. So I'm going to then continue down the assessment sequence and very likely do an assessment of phonics and decoding to check to see if that's the underlying concern, why they can't read grade level text, which it often is. Always, always, always be checking the top part of the reading rope. Check language if you think that's an issue too. And even with older students, I will continue down to the bottom part of the sequence, checking their phoneme awareness, spelling, etc., if their phonics and decoding are quite weak. So then remember, if you remember in the sales model, one of the things that differentiated those highly skilled schools, those highly successful schools, was that they actually used the data. They didn't just collect a bunch of data, they used it. So in order to facilitate that, I developed this checklist for considering, it could be analyzing, could be that word, reflecting upon diagnostic data. And this is very informal. I included it in the handout, so you now have this. It's really just almost a conversation starter, rather than this has been field tested and you can't make any changes. You have to use it as is. It's just a way to think about having a kind of a formal way to keep us honest, I guess, to make sure that if we're collecting this data, that we're doing something with it, that we're analyzing it, we're considering it. So here we spend some time looking at the students' strengths, because we don't just want to work with our students' weaknesses, we have to build on their strengths. So what if they already mastered? What are they doing real well? Do they bring strong content knowledge and language to the table? Many of our students do, but what are their skill needs, and are there other concerns that were raised during that assessment? How are we going to serve this student in this situation? Can they receive all of what they need in just tier 1 instruction in the classroom? Are they going to benefit from some supplementary tier 2 or some intervention in tier 3? We can talk about that, make some decisions. Let's then select our instructional tools. Do the teachers, are the tools well matched to the needs that have been identified? It's not just, this is the program, this is the intervention program we use, so plug the student into there. We want to be sure that we're more thoughtful about that. And whoever is going to be using that tool, do they know how to use it well? Have they received sufficient PD? Do they understand how to do that well? And then how are we going to plan for instructional time? And how are we going to monitor their progress? All of that should happen immediately after diagnostic data. And then in the real world of schools, it really helps to have an action plan. Who's going to do which of these steps? What is going to happen and by when? So I have found something like this to be helpful to keep us all on track and honest with that. So step 2, we're halfway through step 2, then we plan the instruction based on that data that we now have in hand. We can go ahead and plan instruction. And when we're planning instruction, if you're persuaded by the research that I shared with you today, we want to be sure that we're considering all the components of effective structured literacy. We plan for comprehensive, systematic, explicit, intensive instruction that is multimodal and informed by data. And we know from Nancy Young's ladder that her conclusions are, for the students at the bottom of the ladder, this approach is essential, but even our students in that amazing 40% who bring neurological strength to the process, that they are advantaged by structured literacy. So we plan that instruction. Step 3 is we implement the plan, and who implements that plan is our teachers, who have been well informed about the science of effective instruction, effective reading instruction. They are well informed because they have the tools to collect the appropriate data. So those are the two sources of information. What should they be doing, and what does this student need? And well supported, and that was time. They need sufficient protected time. They need the resources, the tools, hopefully a coach to work with them, instructional assistants to work with them, the tools and instructional materials that they need, as well as continuous ongoing strategic professional development. Step 4 of the plan is to monitor the progress. And that is part of the conclusion from our review of effective schools research, that they continuously evaluate their students. And when we're thinking about progress monitoring, like diagnostic assessment, it is differentiated. And remember, each of these categories of assessments are designed to answer different questions. So progress monitoring tools, procedures are designed to answer the question, is the work working? And I often say to my teacher colleagues that I'm working with, or my students, teachers in training, that I feel of all the questions that we ask in the field, that this is the bravest of the questions, the professionally brave question that we ask, and one that most of us, I guess, have not had a lot of training in the importance of asking this question. And we've been insufficiently trained in the tools that we can use to answer this question. I think it's brave because we don't just rely on what one of my colleagues one time said is teachers often just use cardiac assessment. In my heart, I know that it's working. In my heart, I know that this is the right thing to do. We put that aside. Well, we don't put that aside. We always deal with our heart. It's important to do that too. But aside from our feelings and beliefs that it's working, progress monitoring is brave because we look for external objective data that shows us that, yeah, all this hard work that you're doing, this planning, this intensive work that you're doing and the student is doing is working. It is moving that student toward the identified goals that you've set for them. Or it's not working and we need to do other things. And so, like diagnostic assessments, as I said, this is differentiated. We do it differently for children at different ages and stages, but also at different levels of intervention that they're receiving. So for our students who are in Tier 1 and who seem to be thriving with Tier 1 instruction, we don't do a whole lot of progress monitoring, but we do some, and it's much more informal. I would consider Tier 1 progress monitoring would be some kind of daily record keeping of small group instruction. If the teachers are doing small group instruction, which I think the research evidence is very strong that we should be doing some on at least a regular basis with all of our students, if not daily for our vulnerable readers. What's going on in that small group? And can you keep notes of errors that children are making or how they are, the general accuracy of their performance? It can be very informal, but that's a wonderful source of important information to monitor progress. Anytime students are doing written work, that's a huge source of information about how well their progress is going. And if you're using a well-designed comprehensive curriculum, which I hope most people are, they should have some built-in assessments, weekly quizzes or assessments along the way. And that really should be enough for our Tier 1 students, along with, especially in the early grades, that beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year benchmark assessment also serves a function as progress monitoring. But for most kids, that really really is enough data. And that does, we use this analogy in that book, Educators as Physicians. This is parallel to our physician colleagues who may see us once a year for our a wellness exam. We just go in, we have blood pressure taken, cholesterol, we get on the scale, they do a quick look in our ears and listen to our heart and that kind of thing. But it's an annual, and everybody gets that, and no more assessment is needed. If you if you meet the health and wellness benchmarks that your physician sets for you, they don't need to monitor your progress anymore. And we don't need more with our on-level making progress students. Students who are receiving assistance in tier 2 or tier 3, I would strongly consider as one tool in the toolkit the use of the curriculum-based measure that has been called oral reading fluency, those 60-second assessments. Doing them for progress monitoring, we do them much more frequently, not just the fall, winter, and spring, but as perhaps monthly with the students, perhaps every 2 weeks. It can be more frequent than every 2 weeks. With my grandson, who is academically strong, he's in 3rd grade, but I've been supporting his work last year in 2nd grade when things shut down, and this entire year in 3rd grade. He's a strong reader, but he likes having his performance assessed and graphed. And so when he's here, we do a 60-second assessment and graph it. So we do a few times a week, and it's been fascinating to see where he was in 2nd grade. He was doing just fine, but then now he's in 3rd grade and he's making progress and doing just fine. But I put question marks by those things because we don't have good, clear research on how frequently we should be assessing students for progress monitoring. We just don't. There's a growing body of evidence. There are people doing this kind of work, but we don't have definitive guidance. We do generally now, from the research, it does indicate that we should wait until we have there's not firm consensus around this, but there's general agreement that you cannot make a decision about whether to proceed or to make changes unless you have at least 5 consecutive scores. It would be foolhardy to make any changes based on just 2 or 3. If you look at graphs, they tend to go up and down a little bit, but if you wait until you see a pattern, 5 consecutive scores can really show you, for many of our students, a pattern. So I'm including here today some progress monitoring graphs that reflect oral reading fluency data, 60-second assessments of kids from a research study that was done in a school. All the kids in the study were assessed weekly using an ORF, words correct per minute assessment, because it was part of the study. These were 2nd graders. The red line here is what's called in progress monitoring the aim line or the goal line. So this little 2nd grader, you can just glance at it and she's doing exactly as expected, almost perfectly. We rarely see progress monitoring graphs being this clean, but she's just making expected progress week to week to week. Another child in this study was making expected progress and then woo, took off for who knows why. Things kind of clicked for this child. If you've ever taught 2nd grade, you've seen this phenomenon where kids are going along and all of a sudden they just turn into the green kids, I guess, at the top of the ladder. It just all clicks and comes together, and he was doing better than expected. Here is a vulnerable reader. For the first few weeks of school, no progress at all. So what happened in this school, they were following the 5-week rule or the 5 data points. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not sufficient progress. The teachers collaborated, made some decisions about modifying the students' work, and that modification seemed to be what the student needed and got really back on track or very close to being on track. And then here's another student, same school, same good group of teachers, same commitment to making adjustments as needed, and just not seeing the progress at all. So this may, we don't know. We're not gonna make decisions in second grade that this is one of those students in the 5%. But it may be. This student needs to be considered if not already receiving special education services. This lack of response to a high quality intervention is an indicator of a learning disability, perhaps dyslexia. So we would need to take some action. Certainly not wait till third grade. That's another a huge, wonderful source of data that we can contribute when we're making decisions about students' needs. But this student may turn out to be one of those children. We don't have the ability, the knowledge now, and the cognitive psychologists are among the people saying that there is a group, there is a percentage of children, and it may be about 5%, who just do not have the cognitive ability despite our best efforts of ever becoming readers. So when we're thinking about progress monitoring, curriculum-based assessment, I included this in the handouts too for figuring out how to set goals for students. It's quite a process. It's a very sophisticated part of progress monitoring that's worthy of its own discussion. So I put a couple of resources here for you. This book is one of my favorites. I use it all the time. It's in its second edition, The ABCs of CBM, and it really is a simple assessment, or a book. I think this could be used at an undergraduate level, certainly at a graduate level, master's level, to really do a deep dive into curriculum-based measurement, and all the tools it provides for us. CBM has an over a 30-year history now of research in assessing reading, writing, and spelling, and math. A lot of good tools, and this book describes them really well and gives you some sample tools to use. In today's handouts, I also included an article that I wrote way back when with some colleagues and a graduate student and a teacher who had been part of a field study, one of the early research studies when curriculum-based measures were first invented. She worked at a school district where they did some field-based research in the use of curriculum-based measurement. And I'll just to give you a hint, because I know you haven't had a chance to read it yet, but she started off, this was Candy Einot, was the teacher, and she started off saying that given the mandate to frequently test her students and graph their results, her first reaction was that she was going to quit. She said, I don't want to do more data collection. I don't want to do more paperwork. I'm going to quit. And her husband talked her down from that decision. And she used it because she had to. She was told she had to. And she became a real advocate of using CBM. In fact, she says in the article, if the district tried to take it away from me, I would go into my closet with a flashlight and do it, because it's become such an important part of my teaching. And she shares some real world case studies from students that she was working with. So I think it's a very, even though it's a little old, it's a compelling article, because not much has changed in CBM since we wrote that article in 1999. So we monitor the progress of our students, but we don't just monitor the progress and make those graphs. We do what highly effective schools do. And we, if the students are not making progress, or they're making better than expected progress, we need to make some changes. And so we've identified from the research literature some of the things that might need to be considered for changing. Is that maybe we're using, we haven't matched the instruction to the student's needs. Maybe we're using a program of lower quality, or the way we're delivering it, the instruction is not sufficiently systematic or intensive or explicit. We're perhaps using a good program, but we're not using it with fidelity. We're not using the program with sufficient intensity. We're seeing the child once a week, twice a week for 15 minutes. Maybe that's not enough. And other considerations. And I've created yet another considering checklist, and that's in your handouts too. And I really envision this kind of thing has worked best when a teacher is sitting down with a colleague, ideally a coach, instructional coach, because it's just too hard. We're human beings as teachers, and it's too hard for us to really fully analyze the quality of the instruction that we're providing. It's just too easy to say, of course, I'm using a good program. Of course, I'm doing it with good instruction. Of course, it's got to be the kid. There's something wrong with the kid. That's just human nature. So I think it's always really helpful to have somebody come in, watch me teach, perhaps, and I showed you that graph of that student who, despite all our best effort, didn't make progress. I mean, it's not, we can't always change our way out of this, but we keep ourselves accountable to do our very best. So we make changes, or if the data indicates that the student is doing well, we just continue with the great teaching that we're doing, supporting our teachers all the way for that. But then we want to also remember from the research on effective schools that we don't, we're going to do even better if we share the data regularly, non-judgmentally, collaboratively, and then use that data. So a reminder that that's part of what we should be doing as well. I see way too many people spending precious time collecting data, and then teachers are left alone to figure it out, to analyze it, rather than having that collaborative support. So that's a good image for us to take away from that as well. So I wanted to wrap up by sharing some of the resources that I find most useful, acknowledging that you all are highly experienced and have had lots of amazing professional development. And I looked around on the website supporting the work that you all are doing at the Higher Ed Collaborative, and amazing resources that you have online. So these are just a few that I find that I recommend a lot. That Science of Reading Facebook page, which 92,000 people, I find it fascinating. It keeps me kind of grounded in where teachers are right now in their sometimes desperation to figure out what's going on, what they should have learned. The most frequent question on that Facebook group is, I found this program, is it SOR? Should I use it? Looking for simple answers. So it can be, I don't spend a lot of time on there because there is a lot of people just sort of grappling and flailing around and looking for answers. But it's informative for me to hear the concerns they have. There's another Facebook group that is a private group, meaning you have to join this, called Training Reading Rocket Scientists. And I find that one to be very well curated and moderated, and there's some really good discussions. I've connected with some wonderful resources to share with teachers on that Facebook group, Training Reading Rocket Scientists. I mentioned at the start the wonderful IES practice guides that are all created with your tax dollars. These are federally funded. This is a many-year federally funded project where groups of researchers get together looking at good, solid experimental research that's been conducted in the field, analyze that research, and then put together what are the implications for practice. So there are several guides out there that that I think do a quite a good job translating research into suggested practices. So one is this for K3, the how to teach the foundational skills. And in that one, there is this chart. I just copied this chart. Is there big, the big takeaways from field research is that we do need to be teaching academic language skills. We do need to be developing grapheme, phoneme awareness in our students, in the children. That we do need to teach explicitly, systematically, intensively decoding word analysis for both writing and word recognition. And there is support in the research for having students read connected text every day to support accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. And so then they take those 4 big takeaways and give specific ideas and recommendations. So that's the way that these IES guides are laid out. A new one that just came out, and this is what one of the things I think I saw this first on that Teaching Reading Rocket Science Facebook page. Maybe not, but there's a lot of discussion about it. One of the newest IES guides is Integrating Reading Foundations, a tool for college instructors of pre-service teachers. Woohoo! And they have lots of videos, which that's where I know on that Facebook page, people who have gone in, and there are a lot of demonstration videos. People who have looked at them are saying they are good, valuable, of high quality. I mentioned earlier that IES guide on adolescent literacy that I often recommend to people. I love checking in and reading the thoughts of smart people. So I look at a lot of blogs. I quoted one from Dr. Pamela Snow, the Snow Report. I didn't put that here, but I love that, her work in Australia. Tim Shanahan's pretty much weekly blog that he writes, I find very intriguing and interesting. Jessica Hammond in California writes a blog from Glean Education. Margaret Goldberg and her colleagues on the Right to Read project, a wonderful blog. I'm also a member of the Spell Talk listserv, which right now is not real active, but because I think teachers at the end of the year, teachers and school psychologists and specialists are all kind of tired and burned out. So there's not a whole lot of activity there, but I find that a rich source of good discussions and references to research, and it's just like being in a faculty room with a lot of smart people talking about issues around reading instruction. So you can just Google Spell Talk and you can sign up for that. Conferences can be wonderful. Today, I got an email saying that the Plain Talk on Literacy and Learning conference that's held annually in New Orleans, last year it was moved online, but they're planning to hold it live again every year in New Orleans, somewhere around January, February. They move it because it's in New Orleans and they have to move around Mardi Gras and Jazz Fest. So this year it's going to be in early February. And today they announced that the conference registration is open. And I go to a few conferences every year, but Plain Talk is the one I go to every single year. I've gone every year. I think this will be my 16th year. And it's just a huge resource for me. It lifts my spirits. It gets me back on the saddle. We can do this. It connects me with some of the premier researchers from literally around the world and colleagues that it's just wonderful, wonderful conference. The Reading League is doing good work, trying to connect the research around science with practitioners. I love podcasts. I go out for a walk or a jog when I can and try to listen to a podcast. I listened to one yesterday from the Teaching, Reading, and Learning, that podcast. It was Marianne Wolf was the person being interviewed yesterday. I listened to her during my walk in the morning, and then when I was gardening a little bit in the afternoon. The Amplify podcast has been really good. And then Mark Seidenberg and his colleague have a weekly Facebook Live presentation that they turn into a podcast called Reading Meetings with Mark and Molly, and they go into a lot of very deep topics. There are excellent books out there, and I know that you're getting contact with many of them, but this has risen up high on my list of recommendations for a pre-service comprehensive textbook for use with pre-service teachers. That's the design of this book. It's an edited book. I wrote the chapter on fluency with Marty Haugen, but it's just superb, listed by the NCTQ as one of 14 exemplary texts. So I know it's certainly not the only one, but I recommend it very strongly, at least for consideration with undergraduates. Marty and Susan Smart, the editors of the book, really worked with us all as we wrote this to remember these are pre-service teachers you're dealing with. These are, imagine 19-year-old, 20-year-old prospective teachers who know nothing about teaching. So keeping it clear, evidence-based, very practical, and but very introductory. That's what that works. And also in my introduction, it was mentioned that I helped found a nonprofit out here in Washington that we call Read Washington. This is our logo, ReadWA, and our website, readwa.org. And our mission is to connect teachers with evidence-based practices. And the way we do that, mostly the last 2 years that we've been in, or 3 years now, that we've been that we have been in creation. We started 3 years ago. We have guest speakers, and in October, we haven't exactly set the date yet, but we are so blessed that we're going to have Anita Archer. What we've been doing is online presentations on Saturdays so that people can more likely attend. All of our sessions our speakers have allowed us to record them. So if you can't attend on a Saturday because your kids have soccer practice or it's a birthday or you just don't have the bandwidth to do it, if you go to our website and put your name on our mailing list, you will be informed of the date when Anita is going to come and share. She chose this topic, the science of instruction, bringing to life the science of reading. So that sounds, I'm looking forward to it. I've heard Anita many, many, many times, and I will always make an opportunity to hear her whenever I can. I learn so much from her. So that's it for me. I would honestly love to continue this conversation. You can email me directly at janhasbrook at Gmail, or Twitter at Jan Hasbrook. I have astounded myself that I am really an advocate of Twitter. I stayed away from it for a long time, finally got convinced by a colleague who said, I mean, I just thought Twitter was this place where politicians scream at each other and celebrities talk about their latest facelift or whatever. But what I have found about Twitter is it works really well if you just connect with the people you want to connect with. So my Twitter feed is 100% reading researchers, research connection, resources from groups like the Iowa Reading Research Center and those kinds of things. So I would love to see you there. So I am going to stop my sharing. I see there's been some activity in the chat, and I'll turn it back to the moderators. So that we stay on time, but I'm happy to take some questions if we have time for that.
I think we have maybe a few minutes if there's some questions, if somebody wants to ask, and then we
Okay.
can wrap up. Thank you.
All right. Yes, you're welcome. I see Meg asked a question about integrating reading foundations, a tool for college instructors. That is an IES grant, and Stanley has put a link just about 2 steps above your question, Meg, in the where you can go right to there by clicking that link. And that's an IES grant. So thank you for these.
If you haven't looked in the chat, there's links to the resources. So please copy the chat so you have those resources.
Yeah, that's a good idea. You're welcome. Thank you for the thank yous. Appreciate that. It's been a pleasure. I truly was very excited to create this presentation for you and be with you today. I think what you're all doing, such important work to improve your practice, because think of the impact. I mean, some of you may be new-ish at this teacher training game, unlike me. I've been doing it for quite a while. I'm still in touch with students I trained who are now retiring. Okay, that's how old I am. And I'm still in touch with them. They reach out occasionally and say, you know, I'm still using this procedure that you taught me. They'll share ideas about children that they're working with. The impact can be thousands upon thousands of children when you teach teachers. It's very humbling and exciting, I think.
Well, Dr. Hasbrook, we thank you so very much. And to reiterate what so many people have put in the chat, you were absolutely amazing. We thank you for letting us spend the day with you. It was absolutely wonderful. The resources are in the chat. And I also love the story you told about your grandson and how he likes to progress monitor and actually see the graph. I thought that's wonderful. And it tells us that we can do that with even young children, because they like to see, we all like to see how we progress and monitor.
I wish I had it right here. I could show it to you. Actually, wait 30 seconds. Okay. I can get it and show it. I'll hold it up to my camera. He's so proud of what he's done.
So participants, if you hang on for 1 minute, we'll wrap everything up.
Yes. So back. So again, this is a skilled reader. He's definitely on grade level. And I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this, but so the first here is second grade, when we were monitoring his progress in second grade. And then when he moved to third grade, we upped the difficulty of the materials, changed his goal line. This is the goal 50th percentile for second grade end of year. This was 50th percentile for the beginning of the year, third grade. This is 50th percentile for end of year, second grade, or third grade, excuse me. So we went from, but I just find it fascinating that, and you can see the up and down. It's not week to week, super solid, but the projection, the progression is real clear. He's certainly making progress, and I give him the option. It's not, I don't say you have to do this every week. He wants to. He says, let's do the 1 minute read, and yeah, it's fun.
I love that, and I love that he's enthusiastic about it, because I think that's what you want for readers. Absolutely. So thank you. All righty, we're going to move on. Just want to remind you of our next meeting, which will be September 9th from 9:30 to 2:30, December 2nd, virtually 9:30 to 2:30. And then tentatively, March and June will be in person. So we'll see how that goes. It would be lovely to be able to see everybody in person. So we hope that that works as well. We also want to remind you to look for, speaking of monitoring, look for an email link from Amy Howley so that you can do the evaluation. Evaluations are so important to continue funding for collaborative such as this. So when you see it from Amy Holly, even look in your clutter, because mine always ends up in my clutter, so that you can fill out that evaluation. So we thank you for spending the day with us, and we'll see many of you at 3 o'clock at the Dean's Compact quarterly meeting. So enjoy your hour between now and 3 o'clock. And thank you all for being here. And Jan, thank you so very much. We loved having you with us today. Thank you all.